Brzezinski was the strategist for Jimmy Carter and convinced Jimmy Carter to say, look, the Russians are dominating Afghanistan with a civilian secular government. Let's create al-Qaeda. Let's back Osama bin Laden and give his supporters weapons to begin fighting the Russians, and we can pull a coup d'etat there, and the Russians will fight back, and then we'll say the Russians invaded. And it worked. Saudi Arabia made a deal with America that they would push the Wahhabi extremists, the al-Qaeda, the most right-wing wing of Islamic parties, and it worked. Essentially, al-Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. Well, the same thing was happening in Russia. What Brzezinski wrote was that America's faced with a possibility of not being able to rule the world unilaterally. Any country's economic ability to be self-sufficient means potential military power. And in order to prevent any country from threatening America militarily, you have to prevent it from developing economically. The American nightmare, Brzezinski wrote, was that Russia would get together with Germany and with Western Europe, creating Russian raw materials, German industry, and somehow, finally, Russia would become westernized. America, under Brzezinski's strategy, said this would be a disaster because if Russia's westernized, if it becomes democratic, if Europe and Russia are prosperous, then we cannot control them anymore, and they will have no reason to be NATO. We've got to stop Russia, and the place to stop this Russian-European conglomeration is to split it right at the border down Ukraine. Let's do in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. Let's back the crazies. Well, most of them are the former neo-Nazi groups that have been so prominent that fly the Nazi flag.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours.
Sunday, February 4th, 2024. Thank you for joining me today. Quite a lot of topics we're going to get into today that are something that we don't focus on a regular basis. Some of these are follow-ups. We're going to definitely get into some stuff, assuming we have time, in regard to Israel, Gaza. But we're going to start with an interesting conversation around, I guess we have covered this quite a bit, but just not in the recent, during the coverage and the focus on foreign policy of domestic terrorism. And it's something that we've overlapped with the conversation of foreign policy under the concept of vanilla ISIS, the idea that this was somehow, these groups, foreign entities, were influencing the white supremacists in this country to somehow overthrow a really incongruent, clumsy, not making sense kind of narrative. And we've covered this in the MAGA trap conversation, January 6th, which, if you understand the way we've covered this, it was not meant to say that this was some secret thing about conservatives. It was rather your government as a whole using the concept of being a conservative or a Republican as the narrative to justify what was happening, as in somebody like me, who is not any side of the illusion, but would be framed as such because of X, Y, and Z talking point, would be deemed domestic terrorist, would be dealt with as such. So we're going to talk about this today in the context of the ongoing reality, not just locally in the United States, that is, but in the world, that the U.S. government has created this terrorism industry. And it's something that I keep saying in regard to things like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, that we need to stop tiptoeing around the conversation. We all seem to know what the reality is. The evidence is overwhelmingly clear. The juvenile corporate media continues to act like it's not the case, like they do with so many provable realities, which is that the U.S. government has manufactured, with the help, or how you could look, the power dynamic can be debated, but with the help of Israel and the groups like most of Europe, manufacturing terrorism to destabilize other countries. In the case of the Israel-Gaza dynamic, as it pertains to Hamas, but also just the Middle East, funding the most radical elements they can find in order to basically control or destabilize entities that are less extreme, but don't want to bend the knee or bow to the interest of these foreign powers. So they fund the worst and act like they're trying to fight those people, and therefore, hands bound, we have to go in, forlorn hero, reluctant hero. But we're going to talk about a specific point of this that has to do with the larger narrative around domestic terrorism and the manufacturing of it to achieve these ends, both specifically in the United States, but a case that comes from Australia, just to kind of prime this conversation. And I think it's really unnerving to realize how much power and how easy it really is to just kind of railroad somebody's life for the interest of creating the narrative that there's a domestic terrorism threat. Now, let's be clear. There's obviously, in any moment in time, any circumstances, people could decide to take out, whether because of some mental issue, because they just get so worked up, people can act in violence. And you could call that terrorism. Certainly there's a line there. But the point about this is whether or not there is this building issue that the U.S. government's been pushing, that we're overwhelmed with this internal domestic terrorism. I just flat don't think that's real. I think that there's obvious problems, and I think a lot of that stems from the U.S. government and what they're doing to everybody, but that the idea that there's this rising white supremacy problem that stems from MAGA and the Trump side, I just think that's ridiculous. And there's as many issues to point out within that same community as anywhere else, but it still makes this a false discussion. Now, we're going to talk about that as it pertains to a lot of different things, and there's a discussion that comes back to the United States in the form of Justin Mohn. I believe that's how you'd say his name, Mohn, and a really interesting story about how, disgusting and unnerving, but interesting about how he apparently decapitated his father, and all these narratives around how it's about stopping the government and the woke mindset and all these interesting talking points. And then on the heels of this, the conversation of the Preventing Private Paramilitary Activity Act. I think all of this kind of builds this picture about how they're trying to stop, as I would see it, resistance of any kind to what they're building. And I think illicitly, obviously. And I think that has to be, and to be clear, a militia is foundationally protected in the Constitution, Second Amendment. And this is wildly unconstitutional. So we're going to go over why I think that's happening and how important that really is. We're going to talk about the border, kind of in that same discussion, but from a biometric standpoint. A really great video done by Truth 3 Media, 3 months old, but really important to this conversation about how it's bigger than the party paradigm sides of this. Exactly like I agree with that. Exactly like we've been talking about. And it's something that I think we really should be seeing. It's the bigger conversation of both Biden and Trump with different angles of this, creating the kind of biometric control structure, both in and out. And it's very, very clear. Now, that doesn't have to be the only thing happening, but it's definitely part of this that doesn't really add up, even with the partisan conversation. Why is Biden building wall when he makes a foundational promise about not one more foot? It's because it's all a bunch of narrative, in my opinion, and I think it comes down to the agendas. Now, we're going to talk about a really alarming point, and this is where I tried to connect this stuff, and I think that there's a connection here. You guys can decide for yourself. The idea of the surveillance, just in a general sense. But as we know, this kind of technocratic surveillance, even on the border, is getting more technologically advanced, to make it really simple. And it's ways that, like we talked about, biometrics, iris scans, fingerprints, face prints, but it goes further than that, both in the border conversation, but in a lot of other ways as well. And this is where I'm talking about the internal biosurveillance. Now, obviously, surveillance, you could just say internal surveillance, because that's kind of what we're talking about, but it's under the guise of fighting bad pathogens and keeping people healthy and being on the, watching out for the next disease X. That's where the biosurveillance term comes from. But I'm talking about through that discussion, the idea of internal biosurveillance on a massive population level scale. And I think this is something they've been desperate's not the right word, aggressively trying to achieve for a long time. And we've seen the technology finally come to a point to where I think this is something that's being attempted. I asked that question recently about smart dust. As we know, this is a reality. It's not being talked about. Was COVID-19 and the administration of this injection the obvious problem that was? Was this something of a test? It's just a thought that I put out there in that conversation. Well, and you'll see what I mean by that as we go through it. But Bill Gates, in an interview with USA Today, states the reality that there's a lot of different lipid nanoparticles, and some of them are self-assembling, and just in this casual conversation. And I want to show you why I think that's so important. Lipid nanoparticles being this benign thing they tell you. One of the biggest things I was concerned about was whether or not there was something else there. And I think there's obvious points being made from a lot of different angles. from nonpartisan stances about what they're finding that doesn't seem to be discussed or acknowledged inside of these injections. Some of it, even myself, I think doesn't seem like it adds up, that maybe they're lying, maybe they're wrong. But I do think that there's an obvious possibility that there's something else there. We're finding the DNA contamination, the extra proteins, frame shifting. I mean, it's obvious that there's something wrong here. And so I wonder what else is happening. So the lipid nanoparticle part of this, this is the whole delivery system mechanism. What else could be in there? Maybe nothing, but what else could they put in there? The point is a lot. And we've talked about this being kind of a platform. That's what they're calling it. So with him discussing self-assembling nanoparticles, I mean, that in one case is graphene oxide. But that's not what I mean, we'll show you some overlaps there, but I think this really comes down to the fact that this is just one more step in the same direction about how all this connects, about internal biosurveillance. And from there, many different things. Mapping the brain, artificial intelligence, the brain machine interface. I mean, it all comes back to this kind of concept. And self-assembling nanoparticles. I mean, we've talked about this quantum dot technology. That's one of the central researchers, and that is Bob Langer, the co-founder of the Moderna shot. So a lot of this we'll get into, but I think this relates to this bigger conversation about biosurveillance and where this goes, and including an older program called Corona, all capitals, Corona, about a internal kind of body-to-body, location, but also information relaying system. Kind of hard to miss how that overlaps. Now, we're going to get into some important conversations about Iran, what's happening there, a couple points, and then we'll see if we have time to get through. I'm sure we'll get there, but how much of what we'll get into around Israel. There's some really important points that I want to get into, but I'm not going to mention them in case we don't get there. Push it off to tomorrow, but there's some pretty important stuff going on that, but it's kind of the same stuff we've been talking about, just the ongoing examples of how they're being caught lying about everything and how they just lied about UNRWA. And here's more examples of why. And, right out of the gate, I'll tell you that my thought about this conversation, this is clearly monumentally important. But what's interesting is it kind of seems like everybody agrees. So it's like the vast majority nodding along. Yep, we see that too, Ryan. Yep, we agree. Yep, that's bad. Yep, they're terrible. And the only people disagreeing are some of the media and these authority figures who are completely either influenced, taken, threatened by the Zionist entities or some other factor there. So my point is, should I continue talking about it? I think so, obviously. But it's interesting how the point is to try to influence the conversation, to try to reach people that don't see it. And I think most people do. So just my point is factoring that into how prominent I make the coverage. I think that's really interesting. Take it as a sign of take that as a victory, guys. You deserve the victory for that. The people out there watching these shows and mine and everybody else's, sharing the information, standing up, speaking out. That's why this is changing. Now, yes, it's painful. They're making it painful. That's what happens with a cornered animal that is clearly losing its control. The point, though, is that it is changing in the positive way as they take everything down they can as they go down, but it's still a positive change. And this is what they've been fighting for so long, to get your attention. It's a positive thing. I really believe that. Now, on that long opening discussion, I'd like to start with the article or first to shout out David Shoebridge, who I'm not familiar with, but somebody who shared this. I just appreciate pointing out people who shared the content. Australian federal police spent over 12 months driving a 13-year-old autistic boy and his fixation with the Islamic State, actively encouraging him, then just waiting until he turns 18 to jump up and charge him with a crime. This is all done after, of course, his parents went to them to try to help him. All right, so they went to them and said, hey, my son's autistic. They tend to fixate on certain things. It doesn't necessarily, blah, blah, blah. We'll go into this in the article. So please help us. We don't want him to go to jail. We want you to come up and try to explain why this is bad and coax him away from them. What they do, they entrapped him. Because that's what they do, right? They went to it's not like they discovered this on their own. They went after being called to help this child and immediately went into police mode and figured out a way to put him in prison. I mean, I just can't, I can't express to you the kind of anger that this gives me when you see, especially in a case like this. This is like the example of calling the police because you're worried someone's going to hurt them. So like this, my autistic son is going to hurt himself. They show up and they shoot him. That's happened many times. Not even just with the autistic overlap, which is a really big conversation. They're not trained for that. But the idea being that you show up to stop him from hurting himself, and just because he's, the context ends up that they should not be treating him like a criminal, but this is all that they seem to know. And this shouldn't be taken as a knock on all Australian police or any police. It's about the system and the way that they're being trained, as always. And quite frankly, the kind of person that gravitates towards the continually broken system that it is, sort of like the way the military operates, right? Or politics, right? You try to step up those steps into the Capitol as a person fighting for in truth and, the reality of the world, and you won't last a day. You ask anybody that's been in that system that you step in there and try to like cross party lines and, do things that we all act like they're supposed to be doing, and you'll get pushed out. That's how the system operates, maintaining its own control. So here's the Guardian article, how Australian undercover police fed an autistic, as in feeding him, an autistic 13-year-old, his fixation with the Islamic State. Most of this I want to go over. This is really important. Quite frankly, I think that this stems from what the U.S. government has been doing for a very long time. That's why I opened with that about not just locally, but around the world. Right? The moderate rebels in Syria or any other number of groups you can prove that they have been funding, that we now look back and go, yeah, those are terrorists. And a lot of us were screaming that while it was happening. Or what's going on in a lot of Africa or Libya in general, or Afghanistan or Iraq, or any number of places where they're seeding their own agendas. The Sudan, Congo. I mean, it's everywhere, guys. It's literal, and you could prove this stuff. You can go over it. In fact, there's a great part of the clip we'll go into once we get to the Truth Stream Media point, where they show a bunch of these the older ones, but they're still currently happening, the regime changes. That we still act like we kind of aren't sure it was kind of for freedom. No, they were just straight up overthrowing governments on the record because we didn't have the internet to make it clear. But said this is Australia. This is from yesterday, 2 days ago. Counterterrorism police encouraged an autistic 13-year-old boy in his fixation on Islamic State. And understand, just like anything you might find looking around the internet, looking up ISIS content and their statements and their, declaration of the caliphate, all the things you might find, right? Which, let's be clear, let's make sure we understand this is a U.S. government proxy army, rather a Western proxy army with the acute help of Israel. And I'll include, as I often do, James Corbett's our watch along of his 3-part documentary. The link to his direct link is in there as well. To understand this, the receipts are there. This is 3 parts of a very important overlap to story, and the overlap of all of this with terrorism, to show you that they have created this dynamic to justify what they're doing around the world. Very clear, guys. This shouldn't even be discussed as a possible. This is provable reality. Ben Swan also has a very prominent documentary from a long time ago showing you that they funded and armed and created what we're talking about here today. So that'll be understanding that. In a way, that's what this is supposed to do, right? This is a manipulation tool. But for whatever reason, this autistic kid fixated on Islamic State. And it says and this is the undercover operation that his parents sought help from the authorities. No, rather, I just said that backward. The point is, so this is how you should hear it, that they went to them for help and instead initiated an undercover operation, a sting operation of a 13-year-old autistic boy. Because, there's just that, think about the context. There's that, they're telling you it's this overwhelming problem. There's terrorism everywhere. And you have to do a sting over the process of a 1.5 years with a 13-year-old boy. That's where your resources go. What does that show you? The boy, given the pseudonym Thomas Carrick, was later charged with terror offenses after an undercover officer, quote, fed his fixation and doomed the rehabilitation efforts. I would argue didn't even attempt to do rehabilitation. And his parents had engaged in a Victorian Children's Court magistrate found that, I keep starting in the wrong place. Basically, that his parents had engaged in the rehabilitation. They didn't do it. And this is what the court found. Thomas spent 3 months in custody before he was granted bail. So this kid went to custody. So, jail is not probably the right word, but for a juvenile, but kind of, you're going to juvenile hall, whatever it's called these days. He is incarcerated. A child. Think about being the parent there. After an earlier bail was revoked because he failed to comply with conditions. They're treating this like a terrorist. Thomas, an NDIS recipient with an IQ of 71. Okay, that is mentally challenged with no question. I guess mentally challenged. See, these are terms I'm not sure these days if that applies to specifically being handicapped or if this is sort of a being autistic. I think it's interesting the way that works, where you can have you can excel in certain specific areas, but be under excelling in others. But regardless, just taking it at base value of 71, even as a 14-year-old, that is below average. Simply as that. And again, being an autistic kid diagnosed, was first reported to the police by Victoria's Department of Health and Human Services. So, and this is basically on the idea that he was in school doing things that, talking about this stuff because he was unaware that this was, wasn't aware of what this was, in my opinion, based on the way his parents described this, or really just what it truly meant to be walking around talking about ISIS, right? He didn't grasp what that was. And it says, and then by his parents, after that, his parents then went to the police because of his fixation with the Islamic State, which included him accessing extremist material online, making threats to other students, right? So that's where the authorities came into it. On April 17th, 2021, his parents went to a police station and asked for help because Thomas was watching these videos on his computer and even asked his mother to go buy ingredients for him to make a bomb, something he saw online. Now, all of this obviously sounds concerning, right? I mean, you could easily argue that he really was going to do these things. But when you understand this, when you listen to the experts, the way they engage with him, it seems at the very least like it was more of a fixation, as somebody in this situation tends to do, than something he was truly trying to achieve. But either way, his parents said, come help us. Help us pull him away from this problem, not drive him towards it and then trap him, which is what they did. On April 17, 2021, his parents went to the police station asking for help because he was watching these videos. Thomas was investigated and charged with 2 terror offenses by the Joint Counterterrorism Team, which comprises Australian Federal Police, Victorian Police, and ASIO members. 2 terror charges, not because he carried out a terrorist act, understand. The court granted a permanent stay on the charges in October of last year, but a copy of the decision was only recently been published. The point is the court stopped it, and you'll see why. The community, and this is what they said, and this is pretty scathing, the community would not expect law enforcement officers to encourage a 13 to 14-year-old child towards racial hatred, distrust of police, and violent extremism, encouraging the child's fixation on ISIS. Now, even think about this. Even if you actually thought this kid was genuine in his beliefs, it's a child. The idea that you would coax him into it. It's so mind-blowing to think they ever thought this was going to stand. He said, the court continues, the community would not expect law enforcement to use the guise of rehabilitation to entice the parents of a troubled child to engage in a process that results in potential harm to the child. The conduct engaged in, I think there should be legal consequences for what they did here. At the very least, professional consequences. The conduct engaged in by these groups falls so profoundly, they went on, short of the minimum standard expected of law enforcement offices, that to refuse this application would be to condone and encourage further instances of such conduct, which is, by the way, what seems to happen in this country. It's happened more times than I can count. Fleming found that they also deliberately delayed charging him until after he turned 14, which wasn't necessary. You know why? Because it made him and the parents, it made it much harder for them to argue, which the defense called, if I pronounce it correctly, doli incapax, that probably mispronouncing that, doli incapax, probably Latin, I'm guessing, but it ultimately means that he's a child. So not necessarily criminally responsible for their actions. So point being, when you're 13, it's much easier to make that stance. So they simply waited until he turned 14 so he wouldn't be able to, he'd be less likely to win arguing he was a child. Do you realize how nefarious that is? Like surreptitious, like you're knowingly trying to lead this in. Why? So you can put another notch on your belt? I mean, this is pretty disgusting. Police also inappropriately searched his property shortly before he was even charged. And this is at a time when they pretended they were there to help him. There was a deliberate, invasive, and totally inappropriate search of his bedroom without lawful excuse. Does this sound like people following the law? This sounds like vigilantes. Exactly what they pretend you're not supposed to do. The search involved multiple Victoria police members under the guise of being there to help him, to, as it says, to provide support to the family. The conduct of the law enforcement officers involved subterfuge, just manipulation. Fleming and kind of like cloak and dagger almost, like you're pretending you're there to be something else, but secretly going in the room and searching for things. As you're there to pretend you're helping him, you're searching for reason to put him in jail. There was no evidence that the group took, the police, the authorities took any action in relation to the Human Health and Human Services complaint. Right. So they had an issue before. They didn't do anything about that. They were building a case from day one that's how I read this. An online persona, which later communicated with Thomas, was activated a day earlier. So even before, before they even went to investigate this DHS, the Health and Human Services claim, they'd already built fake personas online to start trapping him, just to make sure you fully see that there's no intention to help this kid. After Thomas's parents spoke to the police, Fleming found a decision was made by the force to manage him therapeutically. So this is how they framed it anyway, right? So they were pretending they were going to help him. His parents provided Victoria Police access to Thomas, which again is an alias, their home, the child's phone, the mother's phone. We never do any of this, guys. Never give authorities an inch. I mean, you could act like that's somehow a bad thing to say. The truth is, whether or not they even mean to, things can be used against you. This is why they say what you say can be used against you in a court of law. The point is, you ask a lawyer. Even with honest police, don't ever say anything. Anything. Even if you're there as a witness. There's cases where you go up as a witness and end up being the one charged with a crime simply because you end up saying things that they use against you. I mean, guys, you need to understand how, I know people that have been through training for police. I've had police in my family. The point is that they are trained to do that. It's pretty crazy. But it says his parents provided the access to all these things and to personal information about his school and his psychologist, all of which they used against him, is the point. Less than a month after Victoria Police started working with Thomas, a case manager was told by a psychologist who was working with them that Thomas's, quote, verbalizations need to be considered within the context of his autism spectrum disorder and possible cognitive impairment. So here's the expert who they're working with, who, in regard to a psychologist, who's telling them, look, you can't look at this like terrorism stuff. You have to look at this as an obsessive fixation for whatever reason through his spectrum. Well, it says one of the key diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity and focus. Obviously, that applies. So you could just have to realize for whatever reason it ended up being this topic. And that's what the caseworker argued, the expert in the topic. And this is the point, is police have no understanding. And you can see that every day by the way they engage with this about autism and how supposed to engage with these people, where they can't stop moving and they're beating them up on the ground because they won't stop, they won't listen to the cop, right? I mean, this is how, I've seen so many videos of it, it's hard to watch. Victoria Police arranged for him to speak to an imam, to meet regularly with Thomas, to discuss Islam and answer his questions. Does that sound like a way to get him away from what he's engaging with? Now, obviously, it's different than speaking about ISIS, but it seems like they were just trying to push him further in that direction. 3 months, and then think about building a case and later pointing out to the fact that, he was meeting with an imam in regard to Muslim religion all the time, which in people's minds would add to the idea that he is a part of that, right? As the culture, and then falling further into the idea of the extremist side of what they frame is what Muslims are, which is not true in my opinion. But it says, but 3 months after his parents went to the police, the authorities started an operation targeting him, codenamed Linster. I don't know what that means, but they even created a code name for the operation while pretending to be helping the child and consoling the parents. It would run in parallel with the efforts to counter his violence extremism. Or you could read as they didn't do that at all. In fact, they went right to trying to arrest him and didn't care about trying to actually help him. An online covert operative was tasked with communicating to Thomas using two different personas, a 24-year-old Muslim man from New South Wales and a more extreme person located overseas. Now, why would you need to do that if your goal was to try to bring him away from this, sit him down and explain to him why this was wrong or whatever else? It says the purpose of the operation was to find Thomas online and engage him in a chat to ascertain his intent, if any. The strategy, and this is after the expert told them that this is not the direction to go, mind you. Yeah, and the point is their strategy, as we now know, was to gather intelligence information that could be used to charge him with a crime. On the first occasion, Thomas spoke with the operative online. He asked, "Officer, are you a spy? And do you work with the ASIO?" Basically, that's one of the groups we were referencing earlier, to which the operative in the role of his first persona responded, "I hate these dogs," collab. The operative then wrote, "Should I ask the name of you?" To which he replied, "I'm a 13-year-old. The operative chatted with Thomas on 55 of the next 71 days, including during breaks at school late at night. Plenty of opportunity to try to drive him away from what he was doing. The operative told an operational psychologist who was expected to provide advice to him about how to communicate effectively online with Thomas, but in her mind, on the guise of trying to help him, they were using this to trap him, that, quote, "This is a kid on the spectrum. I'm letting him do all of the talking and just building rapport, or rather building a case against him," was the point. There were 1,400 pages of online chats between the pair, Fleming found. The first persona introduced Thomas to the second, more extreme persona, who encouraged him to make a bomb, to kill a member of the police. Think about how crazy that is. This is a child, at this point, a 13-year-old child with autism. So when he went to ask for bomb stuff, well, I'm not sure the timing on that, if that's the same one, or either way, they're encouraging him to make a bomb, to kill a police officer. So if he went out that night and shot a police officer, whose fault would that have been? He's autistic. Not to say that that's a complete, lack of accountability, but my God, that's crazy. It says, but the operative gave evidence that Thomas was naive and living in, quote, a fantasy life online. And get this, included by asking questions like whether he could join the kids section of the Islamic State, right? This is a kid that doesn't even grasp what he's doing. On August 8, 2021, Thomas sent a photo to the operative, which showed him wearing a school uniform, a hoodie, and a face mask, and holding a knife with ISIS written on the marker, with a marker. So our clearly it was about, oh no, it's a school related concept, and this is where they just lose all perspective. Now I get trying to be careful, trying to be, nobody wants any children or anybody for that matter to be shot or killed or stabbed. The point is though that you've been driving him for 50 days, 70 days. He's doing this to show you that he's engaged with your conversation, and you use that to act like he was going to do something. It says his house was searched within days of that, and he was charged less than 2 months later. Fleming found that the police, assistant, and deputy commissioners had been involved in authorizing the operation, which resulted in Thomas being charged, and that the Australian police, was at the time aware of his age, his complex mental health issues, and his fixation on ISIS. The decision to arrest Thomas was authorized by an assistant commissioner after a detective superintendent failed to inform them that they had information the undercover operation was having a negative impact on therapeutically changing his behavior. I don't believe that was ever in the process, quite frankly. Quote, it is a nonsense to expect this court to accept that, that's the quote reads, that an effective rehabilitation process can be undertaken when there's a seasoned covert operator online engaging him, encouraging the fixation, and his rehabilitation team, and that the rehabilitation team, his parents, and his psychologist are oblivious to the existence of the covert operator. Think about this. If they're willing to set up a 13-year-old autistic child, what do you think they would do to you? What do you think they'd be willing to do, whether you're an Australian or speaking from the FBI in this country, who does this far more often, as far as I can tell? The rehabilitation of the child was doomed, they say, once the operator connected online, befriended him, fed his fixation, provided him with new terminology, new boundaries, and an outlet for him to express it. What was in part his fantasy world. God, I just think that was really important for everyone to hear. That's really crazy. This is where this is going, guys. And the point here, I'll make sure I add that to the show notes for you real quick. This is the stuff we've talked about before. I just referenced this recently. This is from 2018, the Free Thought Project. Parents catch the FBI in a plot to force their mentally ill son, in this case, not autistic, but actually lower IQ level to the point of like a child, to be a right-wing terrorist. And this is really as crazy as it sounds. It says the FBI knew he was schizophrenic. Underneath his condition, he is a sweet-hearted person, and we are extremely shocked the event happened. However, what truly has us flabbergasted is that they knew he was schizophrenic. The state of Oklahoma found him mentally incompetent, and we, his parents, have legal guardianship over him by the court. Doesn't drive, lives with parents, doesn't have any income, and they literally drove this kid and nothing happened. They caught him in the act of trying to set this kid up. These documents are sealed from the public, which is why no news media outlet has been able to obtain them. Like they would talk about it anyway. The FBI clearly knew that he was schizophrenic because they gathered every ounce of information on him. It says what the public should be looking at is the fact that the FBI gave our son the means to make this happen. He has no job, no money, no vehicle, no driver's license due to the fact that he is schizophrenic, and we, his parents, do everything we can to keep him safe and functional. He has suffered through countless serious, full-blown delusional episodes. But they use this, you see. The FBI came and picked him up from their home, gave him a vehicle, gave him a fake bomb, and every means to make this happen, none of which he had access to on his own, or clearly would have ever done without them driving him to do it. This was a lonely kid who wanted a friend, and they were all too willing to step in and play that role so they could get another notch on their belt, while telling you that there's a problem with domestic terrorism. This really is alarming, guys. Now, I'll include this as usual to overlap this in your mind, which is kind of where we're taking this, to the idea of these, like the Patriot Front. This is where the vanilla ISIS discussion comes into play. The idea that they're trying to use these very people, children, but in other cases, manufactured proxy elements to create the illusion that this is a growing problem while they manufacture threats. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not actual threats, but it means clearly they're more interested, as I can see, in manufacturing this illusion to control you than actually doing anything about the problems. And on top of that, most of the problems are groups they're working with, funding and arming, like the groups like we're going to talk about here. But this is entitled Patriot Front, January 6th, and the Vanilla ISIS PSYOP. This one, I'm using the image again today. This is an older show. Why the FBI manufactures terrorism. And here is the Intercept article from 2015. Why does the FBI have to manufacture its own plots if terrorism and ISIS are such a grave threat? It's amazing how we can't piece that logic together. Now, this brings it to the United States, and this was on the 30th of January of this year. Justin Moen, decapitated his father. Why doesn't that move? There it goes. Decapitated his father, 68, and brandishes his severed head during gruesome 14-minute-long anti-Biden YouTube rant. Now, this is this to me is, there's only two or three things I think this is what's even possible here. One is the obvious, that this kid is a deranged, mentally, he's sick, right? He's a psychotic kid that has lost touch with reality, for any number of reasons on that side of it, too many psychological pharmaceuticals, too many, whatever drugs he's getting elsewhere, whatever's in his, who knows what other things are being done by not even intentionally that have caused this kid to kind of lose touch with reality, or, the constant propaganda or the constant two-party illusion politics manipulating the way he thinks, or, driving them to extremism to manipulate their own agendas. But that's one possibility. He just mentally has a problem, right? And I'll show you why that seems quite obvious. What we have to ask the real questions here about whether or not this is something else. We keep talking about the idea, and this overlaps with the possibility of the kind of discussions we've had about the biosurveillance, but even further than that, right? The ferret nanoparticle concepts of actually controlling what people do and think and feel. These are very real, as much as every time we talk about it, someone's out there shaking their head, oh, here we go, despite the fact that it's been peer-reviewed, studied, multiple even mainstream articles about how this has already been done. Right. I mean, since I'm even mentioning it, I'm not going to go into it in depth today, but I'll give you this article, which is from the Rockefeller Foundation. And if you actually take the time to read it, should you care enough, it literally in 17, describes how they've used this a variation of different types of outward, optogenetics, magnetogenetics, and all of them apply in this, but using them to literally control the movements of these mice using ferret nanoparticles. Very real, old. And I believe part of what's happening today. Not necessarily that is the controlling part, but that this is being driven towards, but we should ask that. So that's one thing we should actually consider. But you can even go more simplified and talk about things like MK Ultra or these kind of very real projects that we can prove never really stopped about driving that. But all that aside, the point is that whether or not it's been created, it's still being used, as always, to justify the idea that this is a growing problem, specifically right-wing problem, with links to militias and all those different conversations we've talked about. So here's the information. Hours before his arrest, Moen held up what he claimed was his father's head during a politically charged rant in which he claimed that he was the president of the United States, and he posted on his YouTube channel. Sounds like a very sane person. Moen said many saw him as the Messiah and wanted him as president, while urging relatives living with federal employees to murder them. He blamed the federal government for woke mobs and migrants he claims are destroying the United States, and ranted against globalists and communists. Sounds a little too on the nose, doesn't it? Now, what's interesting, by the way, is, globalists are different than communists. So it's funny. Like, in fact, the point is a globalist would seemingly supersede pretty much any of these other ideologies. So it's funny. It just kind of feels like they're just throwing things out for narrative talking points, right? So deranged? Yes, possibly. But the fact that all these different points are coming out makes you wonder if there's something else driving this. It seems very self-serving, doesn't it? Says the appeal. I'm only saying that because it's certainly possible. Quite frankly, what seems like the most logical case is that the guy is just he's deranged. But why is a very real question. Antidepressants? What kind of pharmaceuticals was he on? We don't talk about this enough. The appalling 14-minute clip, which remained on YouTube for 6 hours after he was posted, and of course, already being used to justify more censorship, more control, more real-time screening of what's going on the platforms everywhere, digital IDs, all of that stemming from things like this. Before being taken down, it sees Moan held up his father's head in a bloody plastic bag, having declared, "Violence is the only solution to the federal government's treason." See that? See how interestingly that overlaps with what we're being pushed on right now? I just think that's really hard not to see, but he could just be deranged and being sucked into the two-party illusion talking points. But he says, "This is the head of Mike Moan, a federal employee over 20 years and my father. He's now in hell for eternity as a traitor to his country." But it seems, at least as the Daily Mail reports, that he wasn't actually a federal employee. So that's interesting. But it says his father is believed to have owned two businesses, a cleaning company and a literacy initiative, neither of which appear to be linked to the federal government. So maybe crazy. Maybe there's a secret thing going on there that we don't see. I mean, we ask these questions. Don't just fall into one of the assumptions. In the beheading clip, he rants about taxes, declaring the economy is near destruction and most Americans can no longer afford the American dream. See, it's points like that that make me kind of go, that feels very contrived. Quite frankly, I don't know anybody on either side of the paradigm or aware that it's an illusion who believe that there's an American dream right now. So it's interesting that would be the point that, we can't afford the American dream. Well, even the people that are talking about how we can't afford to live here are not of the mind that should they have enough money, they would be living the American dream. It's an illusion. To quote George Carlin, you have to be asleep to believe it. That's why they call it the American dream. It's absurd that we ever pretended that this, like the point is that people fleeing into this country from because of U.S. foreign policy in most cases, it's not because they're fleeing for the American dream. They're fleeing to get away from what the American dream is doing to them. But either way, I find that to be kind of a standout point, that it seems like exactly what your government with the mindset might, push into reality. Again, I'm not even saying I believe that's what's happening, but just consider that as a possibility. Again, just so it's clear for people that want to frame me saying that statement right there, the other one I just read, the only way to take care of him is to kill him kind of a thing, take that out of context, is that I think this kid seems like he's struggling. He says he said there was a globalist and communist plot, which I kind of find contradictory in a way, against the United States before ranting about the federal government and holding up his dad's head in a silver bucket. Didn't it say a bag up there, which is interesting? Moen's rant continued, addressing U.S. postal workers, journalists, federal debt, and the Federal Reserve, the border crisis, Antifa, and the woke agenda. My God, checking off all the boxes, are we? He said the traitorous Biden regime wanted to send Americans military overseas to fight for Ukraine and die in a Russian winter. He ranted against tax evading big tech companies and those behind the U.S. prison system. Most of the things he's even pointing at are things that were like, well, yeah, that's a problem. But now that the crazy guy said it, it's interesting. Moen rallied against the network of evil he said was plaguing America. He claimed to have worked as a contractor for Microsoft. He said and saw how the company was evading billions of dollars of taxes. He claimed he whistleblew to the IRS about it 5 years ago, and they simply looked the other way. And that the FBI showed up and threatened to arrest him. Certainly could all be made up, but what's weird is that Daily Mail makes no effort to try to, investigate that or even get so. Maybe he worked for Microsoft. That would be pretty damn interesting. And then down here, last is in one unhinged post, he wrote, "Even my own family upholds this cult belief and is willing to go to jail to prove it." This is interesting. He says, Donald Trump, "If this does not get fixed ASAP, you will also be in jail for the rest of your life after I sue you for everything you own." That's not a threat. That's a promise. And then I think he said BITCH. That's interesting. And it turns out that he was suing the federal government like multiple times and continuing to fail. So definitely something pretty strange here. Now realize this could still be some kind of psyop, whether or not he is actually just still deranged, right? Either way, we should always ask that question. Now, my point is, I don't know. I don't know whether this is a manufactured thing or not, but it is sure as hell still being used that way. Here's what I'm seeing. All right, that one's included. This is Newsweek. Is Justin Moen a Trump supporter? What we know. Like, why in the world does that even why is that relevant? Other than from your contrived two-party talking point narratives. That's sad because they're trying to make that the case. But how about the one that they tried to tell you was a right-wing killer and it turned out they were a secret Democrat? Like, they don't ever talk about the follow-up. And I don't think that's because it's about them fighting for one side of the paradigm. I think it's because this is a clear, contrived agenda to make this about right-wing terrorism. Not because it's about really right-wing or left-wing, but because they will use this as the teeter-totter of time, as I've shown you so many times. 30 moments ago, down looking back in history, it was the Democrats were the sane party, and the Republicans were the crazy evangelicals. And over time, even before that, you could do the same thing. Over time, it flips. I think I'm really wondering these days how many people out there truly understand how this is an illusion, and even then, still choose to partake in some way about voting, for a left or a right or whatever, or voting at all for that matter. But we have to be, it's like talking about ISIS and the funding of the United States. It is not real. These people are on the same side. They're your government. All of them. And it's about creating the narrative to keep you in your place. That's how I see it. But here we are, Newsweek. Was he a Trump supporter? Here's one of the few of the posts we'll see, and you can see that there's a million of them. A far right-wing man. Like, how would you get that from reading that article? In fact, his points even seem to be kind of like back and forth from both sides of the paradigm. Doesn't seem to be. I mean, it's weird that they would fixate on that when there doesn't seem to be any real indication that he was right wing or either side for that matter. It says a far right wing man named Justin Moen decapitated his father and then made a video calling for a patriot uprising against the LGBTQ community and woke mobs and a return to Christian values. It's about trying to frame this as the militias and the right wing and the MAGA trap conversation. Are we going to address how dangerous the far right is? That's how this is going. But here's a really interesting part of this. This says, yet Elon Musk, let's say just showing you the post, man beheads father and so on. Yet Elon Musk and Linda Yaccarino are claiming that they're making Twitter X safer for people to use at a social media Senate hearing today. Yet they are censoring the news about Justin Moen because it makes far-right MAGA crowd look bad. Now, again, I don't even think even remotely I don't think you could make the argument at this point in time that he's definitely a Republican or MAGA or whatever. That's just a self-serving point. Certainly could be, but it doesn't seem to be clear to me based on the information that I can see on this topic. But that does seem to actually be happening. Now, what's interesting to me is you can search Justin. Here, let me do this. Wait, did I accidentally close that? That's too bad. I already had one open. Let me do this. That's how I found the last one. Justin Moen, right wing. Look at that. And you'll find a hell of a lot of, pretty prominent accounts going right wing, nut job, crazy man, right? But if you try it, I'll do a new one just so you can see it. Let me just do this one. Let's do just Justin Moen. Look at that. Something went wrong, but don't fret. It's not your fault. Doesn't that seem a little fishy? Now, I don't take this in the same way they're trying to frame it. I don't take this as Twitter covering up for the right-wing terrorist. I think this is about manufacturing. You could look at this a couple ways. The Streisand effect, right? The idea that by keeping this kind of secluded, people will seek it out even more. But doesn't that seem strange? You guys can decide for yourself what the motive may be there. But I think what we need to realize coming from the point that this is not left or right, this is about you being manipulated by your government and Elon and Twitter being a huge central part of that right now. By the way, I reached out to David Icke, and I'll show you where he made a point about this later in the show today. That I'd love to have him on to talk about this, and I think I'll be able to get him on. I was talking to Gareth and Richard about it. I'd love to get him on to talk about specifically his points he makes here in a second about Twitter, about the control, about the way that the illusion of it all. I think that'll happen. But that's pretty interesting to me, right? So now you've got them feeding this into the narrative like we're trying to suppress this concept. And this all comes now we can see now this building discussion going into something like this. Preventing Private Paramilitary Activity Act of 2024. I just can't, most of what they seem to do is unconstitutional. But this is like coming out with a bill that says, you're not allowed to own a gun act. It's like, hold on a second. That's, directly contradictory to the Constitution. Let me show you why. Oh, of course it refreshed. Hold on. See if this works. Oh, you know what? I didn't do this with this one. I knew I should have. I'm sure I can pretty much remember where it was. I was using my new, this thing, highlighter, but it was the other one, I guess. That's why it went away. Oh, well. So here is, for the podcast, the bill preventing private paramilitary activity of 2024. And it goes to the point where it says, it shall be unlawful to knowingly, in a circumstance. Oh, actually, I forgot. We want to start here because basically it says in a circumstance described in section B. So to understand what that even means, you go to section B, where it says the circumstances described in the section are the conduct described in the subsection A. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. Same point. So these are the circumstances. So bottom line is, it shall be unlawful to knowingly basically act in part or on behalf of a private paramilitary organization. Like, why would you even write it like this? It's so meant to be hard to understand. That's how they do this. You can't be knowingly or unknowingly. It will unlawfully. Oh, geez, I can't talk. It shall be unlawful to knowingly be a part of one of these militias in the circumstances of traveling across a state line or national border. Why would that make sense? So you can't work with other states, right? The use of the channels, facilities, or instrumentalities in the multiple times points out interstate or foreign commerce, right? So you can't use these channels in regard to interstate or foreign commerce. You can't do this while it involves a firearm, explosive device, or whatever else while interstate or foreign commerce, right? Bottom line, you can't bring your guns across state lines in this context. Involves the use of ammunition or large capacity ammunition in the same context when traveling interstate or foreign commerce. Obstructs, delays, or affects interstate or foreign commerce in any way. That's very specific and continually stated. But occurs wholly or within the Commonwealth, territory, or possession of the United States. Now, I don't know if I'm reading that incorrectly, but to me, doesn't that supersede literally everything else? So reading it together, it says, it shall be unlawful to knowingly, in a circumstance occurring wholly or within any Commonwealth, territory, or possession of the United States, while acting as part on behalf of a private military organization with explosives and so on. So that's literally everyone all the time. So you can't be a part of a military paramilitary group within any Commonwealth, territory, or possession of the United States. So why does any of the rest of it matter? You just literally can't do it anywhere in the U.S. That's am I crazy, or is that literally what it says? Now it says the Armed Forces of the United States, National Guard. I think that was it, really. There's other parts down here, but I don't want to try to remember what it was. It'll take me too long. Yeah. So bottom line is trying to claim that it is illegal for you to be a part of a militia in certain contexts, but one of them clearly seems to say occurring wholly within any Commonwealth, territory, or possession of the United States. So just in case you don't know this, the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, not the federal government, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That does not talk about hunting. Like, it's always such a manipulative game to pretend like it's not exactly what that says. A militia is not a government entity. A militia is what's the right way to frame it? It's tangential, right? It's a side thing. It's not part of the official military. It is a group that you align with. Like in this case, this is what typically happens with, you raise your forces and all of a sudden the militias assemble in these states and then you come together and you under some larger organization. The point is, every state under the Constitution has its right to have a well-regulated militia for the state, not for the federal government and foreign policy or whatever else, but for specifically your engagement with other states or other problems for whatever context. Being necessary to the security of a free state. You realize that actually applies to the concept of a tyrannical federal government. And to keep and bear arms. Not specifically what kind, but in any case, the point is, obviously, to say that you can't be part of a private paramilitary activity, that's a militia. They are creating an unconstitutional act, so it's not legal, right? Per Marbury versus Madison, If it's repugnant to the Constitution, it is null and void. That's a Supreme Court ruling. So this is null and void if and when it passes. Now, lastly, on this point, I wanted to point out this video. What in the hell are these people talking about, he says. This is an InfoWars video with, I'm not exactly familiar with this person, Ivan Raiklin, but I just want to point this out to you guys. So what we're talking about here is clearly what I think with stuff like this, and Twitter weirdly suppressing this for some reason, driving the narrative. I think it's about intentionally creating the divide to drive this into, I mean, you could go a lot of directions on what they want to accomplish from it, but simply creating the division to keep you destabilized, to keep you not recognizing who the real enemy is. It's not your neighbor. It's not the other side of the paradigm. It is the government who is suppressing you and using this to remove your rights. But what's interesting is you've got people like Alex Jones of the world who seem to be stoking this at every single turn. I just think this is very dangerous. Now listen to what this guy said and the way he engages with this. And this is what we're talking about how it's giving them everything they need.
This is a message directly to every single person on the deep state target list. My assessment, Ivan Raiklin's assessment, that if you assassinate any political presidential candidate, whether it's RFK, whether it's Trump, guess what? America will do the following immediately. They will respond in kind.
Okay, so you literally just said you're going to assassinate people in the government should you believe that one of these people were assassinated by the government. Now, you could argue that they can prove that, but at what point, like, you have to understand, even if you think that's justified, this is literally what they're asking of you. They want you to act in this way. They want you to come out, like, this is what they did with January 6th, right? And so had Trump come out and said, if they do this, we will take you out in kind. Well, that would have been exactly what they wanted, right? But he didn't. He didn't say that. In fact, he asked them to leave. One of the reasons why you might argue that he's not necessarily willingly part of this deception, that's certainly something you consider. To me, that is not just irresponsible. That is driving people to be of the mind that you're going to violently respond should you feel it's necessary. And realize that most of these discussions are based on wild assumptions from people in the two-party paradigm, listening to work like this that gives you no source material, no way to vet this stuff for yourself, but just simply watching videos where they say, I've got a source that says X, Y, and Z. False flag coming on the border, which, by the way, is wouldn't surprise me. I think that's a very likely possibility. But the reason I'm not talking about that reporting today is because I don't see any way to vet it for myself. But I think groups like this are driving you, whether they know it or not, to be a part of this problem. The very false flag they seem to think is coming, I think they're driving you towards.
And they know who you are because we've created the list. So if you go
and that's
to
a major Rubicon. They should know that.
Immediately. You're going to see immediately response, and there are only a few buildings in Washington, D.C. that they will probably do that.
Do you hear what he just said? He's literally saying he's got a pre-contrived list of people that are in the, quote, deep state that they're going to, I guess, attack or bomb or whatever he's insinuating should they think something happened. Like, how do you even vet that process? How do you know all of them were involved? Like, this is crazy. No matter what side you think you're on or what you think is justified, that is guaranteeing you are being what they claim you are, right? I mean, my God, guys, I just think that's wild.
Well, I hope that's not the case, but these people are crazy.
And having said that, if they do that, option 2 behind Trump is going to be so much better for us and so much worse.
Well, I was about
for
to
them.
say,
Right, because, Trump, right? That's the secret. We're all going to be happy and good because Trump's in charge. How'd that work out the first time? How's your shots working out for you that we're not talking about?
they kill him. That's best case scenario.
So Alex Jones literally just said if they kill Donald Trump, that's the best case scenario.
Option 2 behind Trump is going to be so much better for us and so much worse.
Well, I was about
for
to
them.
say, if they kill him, that's best case scenario. From a sick level beating him, oh, please kill him, which but it's so
What?
good after that.
What? Please kill him? Like, it's, I just don't see how you can pretend this is not a stance of like calling for violence. You can, like, here's somebody pointed this out to me that he'll often say, like, don't be violent. They're trying to get you to be violent and blah, blah, blah. Right. I agree with that. The difference is I say that too, but you won't see me outside of that statement calling for violence. I say that because I don't want you to misinterpret my statement as wink, wink, calling for violence. But this is like saying, don't do this, don't be violent. But then in other conversations going, oh my God, we can, like, basically supporting exactly what he's saying right here. That, no, that would be the best case scenario. Guys, I'm very worried about where this stuff is going.
Oh, it's going to be the best cleansing and the fastest cleansing that we've ever seen in my lifetime.
Meaning that if they kill Trump, that they're going to respond in kind and cleanse the deep state. Because they know, right? Because they know exactly who, and I'm sure it's all Democrats because we can trust them.
I assess with almost certainty, with the highest level of confidence, that if they assassinate Trump, it is so game over for them. Wow. And it's going to be so fast. Now, to be very clear, obviously, he has every right to say these things, right? It's not explicitly saying we're going to go kill them. Like it's he has free speech. Obviously, in no way am I saying Alex shouldn't be allowed to say this, whatever. The point is that whether they realize it or not, that's certainly always part of it. That is dangerous. And that will, in my opinion, absolutely drive people to think that they are, like, in the same way that a part of that was happening on January 6th. People like I'm blanking on his name, the main guy, Ray Epps. The Ray Eppses of that whole scenario, who were literally like, we're going into the Capitol, who never got in trouble, who even said he was the one doing it in court of law. The point is that they were trying and they were too smart to fall for it. They, if you're a Fed, get out of here. No, we're not. Like people did. Then there was explicit instructions to not come armed because of stuff like that. My point is they tried though. And this is the same thing in my opinion, whatever we see happening here. Now let's talk about the border side of this, because I agree that there is a problem there. And I think what's really important is that this is a great video. And I think this really does encapsulate the bigger picture, but while still addressing that there's a clear problem here. And I've said from the moment I talked about this, that I feel this is weaponized migration. I don't even know how you can deny that ultimately. As I think Melissa does a good job framing the amount, the timing of it, like there's something very suspicious. But quite frankly, and of course you can call this confirmation bias, maybe it is, I see far, far, far more connections and justifications, reasons to think this might be Israel doing that than China, but certainly possible. And you should decide for yourself based on the facts what you think is happening. But aside from who's responsible, I see another agenda here that we need to discuss about the biometric World Economic Forum, Great Reset mindset that we seem to be not focusing on as much right now, as we're building these things for the incoming threat, right? Did we think they were going to go, we're building this to make sure we can control your lives? Of course not. There's always a manufactured problem that they point at to get you thinking other things. And you get the two-party screamers that jump in and act like that's what's happening. And the majority who sees to some degree what's happening, a lot of them fall for that. But it's not about the two-party illusion. It rarely is. I highly recommend you guys check out their work if you haven't. They do outstanding work. Some of the really great documentaries. I always like that opening for some reason. Downfall of modern society.
Hey guys. So this is another one of those videos that I didn't actually want to make, but I just feel like
Let me jump a little forward just so we get going.
What we're seeing right now. Border isn't just about right now. It's about a future that is being built around us right now.
Right.
So I'm sure you've all seen what's been going on, not just at our borders lately, but it borders around the world, but especially the nonsensical, almost cartoonish situation that's down there at our southern border. With the Border Patrol cutting barbed wire fences. I mean, we live in Texas, okay? And there's what I would call an unconstitutional border check miles inland that we're required to pass through just so we can go to Big Bend National Park. Every single time we want to go to that park, we have to go through that checkpoint to get there. It's the only road.
Doesn't think about that too. Like that's one point that I haven't gotten into. The idea that there's checkpoints for Americans going inside the country more so than a lot of the people that are coming across the border. And I really, really want to stress that these things, I mean, think how you want and perceive this how you want, but at least ask whether this is beyond the two-party illusion concept, right? And it's not about the Democrats trying to trick you for X, Y, and Z, that it's bigger than that. That's really where I see most of this going. Right. But that can be the case, and you can still acknowledge that there is a problem, right? By acknowledging that there's a manipulation of what's happening with the migration and the immigration that's happening is not to then side with the Republicans. That's one of the problems with how the two-party illusion works so well, is that people get so trapped in these talking points and they're afraid to even look like they're siding with the other side when it's not about two sides. It's about just being honest with the truth and what you can prove.
So for them to suddenly let in record numbers of thousands upon thousands of people and fist bump them on the way in doesn't actually make any sense, right? This is a country where, as an American citizen, I'm expected to let a TSA agent go to second base on me simply because I want to get on a plane.
So messed up.
Any plane, not even a plane that's leaving the country, just getting on a plane at all. But this is the kind of thing that's going on down at the border. And media's all over talking about it, and everyone else is talking about it on social media, and it's everywhere all the time. And then all of a sudden, just like that, you have President Biden announcing that due to the crisis, right, he has no choice now but to build 20 more miles of border wall with Trump-era funding because they want to follow the law.
There's nothing under the law other than they have to use the money for what was appropriate. I can't stop that.
Do you believe the border wall works?
No.
This is not the way that we believe is going to be effective here. We believe in modernizing the system, not actually building a wall. The president said himself he does not think this is effective, and so we're complying by law. And we believe that in the rule of law here, and we're moving forward and getting that, in following the law.
Yeah.
The Biden administration is announcing some drastic action to address the migrant crisis as illegal crossings surge right now at the U.S.-Mexico border. It says it will waive 26 federal laws and regulations to build more barrier walls.
There will not be another foot of wall constructed in my administration. Number one.
There will not be another foot of wall constructed in my administration. How can you say that he's not breaking that promise?
Well, what I can say is that there's a law that the DHS is complying with. We believe in the rule of law.
Doesn't that just infuriate you? Like, it's so petty. Why can't he just come out and say, well, the dynamics changed. Our opinion has changed. Here's why. Like, be a grown-up, man. Like, to come in there and be like, and to literally pretend like he's some abstract way not breaking what he, while he's building more than 1 foot, right? It's just so painful to watch them try to squirm in that. I just don't know why they do that. We all see it. Just come out of it and at least manufacture a fake excuse for why you change. Don't try to pretend like the obvious is not happening. It's painful to watch, but that's literally all they do.
Waive 26 federal laws.
And so we're complying by law, rule of law. There's a law.
Despite the fact that the Biden administration will admittedly be breaking some 26 laws and regulations in order to build this. And notice what Biden says there. He says he knows this won't work. But when he's asked, he says the money was appropriated for this wall. I can't stop that. So this is a guy like other presidents we've had who does whatever he feels like whenever he feels like it, except when it's something he literally promised during his campaign that he would not ever be doing.
Right. We're going to allow the biggest genocide we've seen in our lifetimes. But, my hands are tied. I just can't circumvent this. It's obviously a lie, as your point. This is something that the government wants to achieve, and I think that's becoming very obvious.
That doesn't make any sense. Okay? And being libertarian on X said, now Biden wants to build a wall. This one will keep people from leaving. And my brain just kind of jolted when I read that, because I remembered that Trump didn't just sign an EO regarding border walls the first week after he was inaugurated. He signed one regarding expediting a biometric entry-exit tracking system.
Right.
So my question is, does this Trump-era funding that Biden's talking about with this border wall include the expediting of that biometric entry-exit tracking program? Because those two things were right next to each other on Trump's list of things to do.
Remember the whole point about, it's not just, stopping you from coming in, it's stopping you from going out. And it was like, oh, you're so crazy. It was right on the surface. I mean, the point when you leave, the point is it goes both ways. It's a biometric tracking system that goes both ways for your safety, of course.
They went hand in hand. Okay. If you'll recall, one of the very first things he did after he was inaugurated, so this is week 1 of him getting in there, was sign an executive order on border security and immigration enforcement improvements. And that had to do with the southern border wall. On day 5, he signed that. 2 days later, he signed another related EO titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, based supposedly on the 9/11 Commission report's recommendations.
Right. And, pointing at all the groups that they funded, created, and armed, because they're really scared of that.
And he was calling for an expedited biometric entry-exit tracking system. It's right here.
Right there. Expedited completion of the biometric entry exit tracking system. Now, she goes on to point out that they kind of pushed back on that. They got it removed, but then it got reinitiated on another executive order right after that.
States, as recommended by the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. It was revoked. It was replaced with another EO that also had the biometric tracking system in it. And by the end of 2017, you had Homeland Security quietly testing out facial recognition software in airports.
Derek talked about this.
A report by the Center on Privacy and Technology, which comes out of Georgetown University's law school, said violated Americans' privacy. And they referred to the program as, quote, an invasive surveillance tool that the department has installed at nearly a dozen airports without going through a required federal rulemaking process. So that was by the end of Trump's first year in office. But the truth is, this biometric entry-exit program that Trump was in such a hurry to push through, that he signed an executive order just 7 days after he officially became president, that was not even remotely his idea, or even a new idea. Because Obama tried to get that done before the end of his second term, and he didn't get to it. Congress before that had set a deadline for it in 2006 under George W. Bush. But again, it didn't happen. But this even goes further back than Bush Jr. and 9/11, because this goes all the way back to 1996, when President Clinton signed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act into law, which required a biometric identifier be included at the country's borders. So Trump was really just finishing something there that his old golfing bud Clinton started. But realize something here. This isn't going to be just for people visiting, just tourists and migrants and whatever. This is going to be for everybody.
And again, don't think bigger than just, to keep terrorists tracking. This is bigger. They don't need that much biometric information to be able to do this. Right. And of course, you could argue that they could be, tricking you by looking different and so on. Well, but the point is they're talking about facial recognition, DNA information, that's only if they have a justification to take your DNA for some reason, but that's part of it. Derek's talked about this, as well as iris scans, face prints. I mean, it's wild. And all of this stuff is being cataloged, not just because people are coming in, but as you as an American leave. Now, why does that make sense? Why do they need all of your cataloged information? Are you going to sneak back in as a terrorist, as an American citizen? It's not what it's about. And remember this, we're going to get into it next, about the larger picture of not just tracking, the progress of pathogens, but ongoing population scale surveillance internally, biosurveillance. And what I want to stress again, as much as these things sound ridiculous to some people who aren't watching what they're working on, this has been a long-term project that they are actively working towards, and in many cases publicly discussing this, in cases where they're saying this is to keep you safe and to fight off bad guys or whatever they're applying it to. But it's very real.
Locking this place down, and it's going to be for everyone. So this article here from February 3rd, 2017 spells it out. It repeats the part that I just read to you from Section 7 about how he's directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to expedite the completion and implementation of the biometric entry-exit tracking system for all travelers to the United States, as recommended by the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. That means the U.S. government would have to install equipment that would do either fingerprint or iris scans on everyone entering and leaving the United States. Everyone entering and leaving the United States. So that's everybody. Okay, again, the timing of this wall being built by a guy who literally ran on the premise of never building another foot of wall.
There will not be another foot of wall constructed in my administration.
And the cartoonish level of buildup that just happened at our borders that doesn't even make sense almost, all of a sudden like that.
Just as a side note, as I pointed out before, look at what we're seeing. Is that all Chinese? Which is what one of these narratives are spinning, and my point is simply that it does not seem to be There's a lot of selective narratives going out. Consider what's being said, of course, because maybe they're right. But I feel like there's a lot of partisan overlap to something that seems to be very real, but that is self-serving, right? And it's tends to omit the larger point, especially when it comes into like the danger areas, whereas you're not going to see many Republican commentators ever point out a problem with Israel. That's important.
Justifying this move from a guy who literally ran on the premise of saying he was never going to build another foot of wall. To renounce citizenship. This wall for keeping people move from a guy who, especially with what just went down in the last few years. And so I've got to ask, is this wall for keeping people out or keeping people in? I mean, just on a side note, do you know how hard it is to renounce citizenship? The U.S. has some of the most punishing tax burdens for citizens living abroad of any nation on earth. And used to be, if you didn't like it, you could just renounce and leave. You know, all those people online all the time, like, well, if you don't like it here, because you're always critical of stuff, you don't like it, you could just leave. Well, guess what? You actually cannot just leave. Did you know that? You actually can't just leave. Back in 2010, they passed something called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which is FATCA, which forces banks around the world to report activities of anyone they suspect of being an American to the IRS. And that same year, they first started charging people a fee of $450 to renounce their citizenship.
They clearly see you as an asset, guys. And yes, that definitely applies to like the Corporation Act, these different conversations. It's obvious that they see you as something that they own.
All of a sudden in 2014, that number shot up to $2,350.
Jeez.
So that's $2,350 you have to pay or you cannot do that. And they will come after you. They're coming after people. They were threatened to live there for like 26 years. Just leave. Derisive air quotes. That's not a thing. In fact, I just saw this article a couple days ago about how there's a class action lawsuit happening right now of people who are alleging that this $2,350 renunciation fee is arbitrary, capricious, and illegal.
Now, here's a kind of an abstract point, but consider this in the context of like, you know, depopulation conversations, just to show you that kind of a counterbalance. Like, why would they be fighting in a way to keep you here when the argument would be that they don't want that many people? You know, I think that's a little abstract, but I think what's interesting is we have to remember that they definitely see you as chattel, right? As the average person who is necessary to the working systems. In a way also, though, they're driving towards an AI future where you won't be needed, but now you are. And so I think that's interesting. You have to literally pay over $2,000, and even then probably not going to happen, to be able to leave and technically no longer be in this country as an American.
So that's going on. So there are lots of people right now that are suing the government of interconnected databases and profiling algorithms that when you start reading the details of it, it sounds an awful lot like DARPA's 2003 Total Information Awareness Program, which I'm sure you all remember the logo for that one. DARPA couldn't get away with it because Americans didn't want the government vacuuming up all their data. But apparently the tech giants is just totally fine for some reason for people. I don't understand what makes it different. I don't know that there's a lot of meaningful difference sometimes between corporations and our government, but for some reason people seem to think so.
The point is that Palantir and these different groups are using for, you know, facial scans and the different technology for this.
I mean, it makes sense to call it Palantir if you've watched Lord of the Rings.
It's just funny. These people are too much. They're too obvious sometimes.
That's how water resources have been tightly controlled and locked down with drone protected walls and fences and stuff. And surveillance tools are just ubiquitous everywhere.
Let's see, 13,
and
25.
There's a scene just for a
So here, this is interesting. There's a scene in this
privilege
movie
of being allowed to go out of here.
The scene in this movie she's talking about, I think it's called Water Sleepers or Dreamers or something like that. I forget, but he's leaving the country to go to Mexico. And it literally has a gun with an eye scan that says, like, you have to check out before you go. And then they scan him and they, okay, you're allowed to leave. Just making that point. I think that's pretty interesting.
And by the way, the UN is paying a lot of the costs associated with people coming here from Latin and South America.
One of the things that is happening here and all along the migrant trail that led here and beyond all the way up to the border is that the United Nations is handing out cash and debit cards and rental assistance and movement assistance to immigrants to help sustain them on their road to El Norte.
Now that's obviously very interesting, right? And the question should be whether or not this is, part the deliberate intention to drive them in this direction for, whatever argument you think they're trying to achieve, whatever agenda. But my thought is I find it far more interesting, or I'm interested more in where is this starting from? Like, this is what they're saying is these people are, on the move, and they're giving them different cards and things to help them on their way. You could argue, which I don't think is necessarily the case, that it's all just altruism, that they're there just to help people who are in need. And I'm sure there's some people that work for this entity that think that way. But I think from a larger, top-down agenda, the UN is not out there to help people. It's my personal opinion. But ultimately, where does it start? What started this? Where is it all stemming from? That's what no one seems to, I want to understand that more about what's actually driving this from behind. That's where I think we're beginning to piece together in a lot of ways that don't seem to add up until you add in other factors. But I think either way, you're talking about instead of helping the situation they're currently in, like maybe in this case, dealing with whatever foreign policy is causing the destabilization, or finding out what is happening to cause the reason they're leaving from their country. Like, these things make more sense than to just dump money in their hands to help them into other areas, right? It does definitely seem to add to the larger globalization type agenda.
They're directly giving people debit cards with cash payments. They're paying for travel costs like bus tickets and hostels and stuff along the way. And this has been going on.
Isn't that strange, though? To what end? Like, why wouldn't you give them, I guess free movement, they're allowed to move where they want. But if you're giving them transportation, like, do they want to go anywhere else? Maybe they just give them money to succeed where they are. Like, it definitely feels like a push to keep moving. Or maybe that's the way it's being framed. But we're going to talk about the Mayorkas overlap as well with the group that he's a member of the board of, which is part of this as well, I think.
For years. And then you have people saying, why would the UN do that? Well, why would they do it? Do you think it's just because of some humanitarian mission and not because the UN wants to be the head of the global world state, the creation of which is greatly hastened by mass migration overwhelming national borders all over the place?
Right.
And handing out these cards and the digital IDs they've been signing people up for and stuff like that, handing these cash cards out and what have you, feeds certainly into their UN Agenda 2030 goals.
Right. And this is the bigger point about this is bigger than the two-party paradigm talking points of this, right? So in the process of all of this, what are you doing? I think, as Orwell just said in the chat, even in Afghanistan, they were just grabbing up all the biometrics from anyone they could, and there wasn't even a justification at that point. So clearly this has been a building point. And I do think, like I was saying, this builds to something much bigger that they've been working on. But either way, in this process, you're giving people these cards and different things, and while you're doing it, you're setting them up with a digital ID. Seems to be meeting these agendas.
Specifically goal number 1, which if you look on the regular chart is just vague, no poverty, right? But as you can see in this May 2023 Common Agenda Policy Brief called A Global Digital Compact, an Open, Free, and Secure Digital Future for All, if you come down to page 8,
this is pretty interesting.
There's the color-coded chart again, and they're showing a little bit more about what they mean about these things. And no poverty specifically says...
This is pretty crazy, actually. This is kind of like what we talk about where, like with the Greater Reset, like their argument is, well, their poverty's bad. So what do? Digital IDs with a bank and a mobile account. And really? That's your solution to poverty? Give them technology? It's just crazy. That doesn't even make sense. It's like you're skipping a point, right? Maybe give them some food first, right? Or rather, I guess that's hunger, but just, maybe do something other than give them a digital ID that you would then need something more to be able to engage with. Like, it's very strange, isn't it? So obviously it's right under the surface. This is about something much bigger. And number 1, poverty is digital IDs linked with your bank account or your mobile money accounts. We know where this goes. And I think in general, that was mostly it. She goes over more points about the, let me see if there's something there.
Countries worldwide. Refugees who are verified will then be eligible.
Oh, that's right. I didn't want to look at that right there. This is what they're doing, right? So under the guise of helping them with this process, they're taking, as you can see, iris scans, fingerprints, everything. Why would you possibly need all of that? And then they show them put the iris scan thing on their face.
The government is using UNHCR's advanced biometric registration software, which has already been used to register some 4.4.
And remember, the whole WorldCoin thing, they were doing the same thing. From every angle, it seems they're desperately out to get all this information. That seems very coerced.
Million refugees in 48 countries worldwide.
Flushed with success.
And then I'm going to go
Just by
past
the
it
way.
because for time in general, but she goes over this point about showing you that they're talking about helping these countries, while the fact is they created the very problem they claim they're trying to solve, which is always how this works.
Just by the way. But parts of our government have also
The United States is the #1 donor to the UN in this case.
been involved for decades in the purposeful destabilization in Latin America and others via CIA-backed wars and coups.
Still to this day, by the way, and that's my point about whether it's bombing or just ongoing destabilization and starvation tactics that affect these countries until they are, compliant with whatever the U.S. ever wants. That's what they're doing. That's been doing to Venezuela and other places. Like that's why people flee, to seek something not being, in a world where they can, like with Palestinians, where they can actually have self-determination without, every 30 seconds being threatened with rape, murder, and theft. And this goes on to simply point out 53. The overthrow of Iran, Operation Ajax. She talks about the 60s, and she talks about Pinochet. She talks about there's so many examples of how they were and still are doing this. Now, make sure you watch this, guys. They always do amazing work. It's really a great kind of overview of a lot of different points that are important, and I'll include the link as always. Now, here is just a quick clip showing. I think I might have even shown you this before. A woman who went to China, who I think she has Chinese family, but and Chinese citizenship, but she's not necessarily from there. I'm not sure. I forget the actual full. That's just a clip of it. But the point is that she's there and she's trying to use her a phone and a card that was set up for her, and they figure that out, and they demand a facial scan. Otherwise, everything gets shut down. That's where we're going, and it's just naive for people in this country to continue to kind of like snidely act like this is a conspiracy theory, while it is not just real, it's already happening in multiple locations. In fact, partly in this country already. Like I think I even just saw Matt Taibbi talking with somebody about this, and they were making a kind of a joke about something tangential to it, but it kind of felt like they were acting like this wasn't a real, like it's conspiracy theory. I just don't understand how people can be so willfully dismissive of things that we can watch happening. This is your future.
So the latest in this dystopian outrage that is now all of China, apparently, is I once again cannot buy food. A couple days ago, my uncle and my cousin helped me get a cell phone that is linked to a Chinese bank card so that I could buy anything. But now, apparently, it has been flagged for some reason, and I have to pass facial recognition identity verification, which is insane, because all I want to do is just spend my gift card balance on this debit card.
This is so creepy, man. The way they make her open her mouth. Now, one point to include while she's doing this is the argument was made, and I think it's a fair argument, that the mask one part of that was to help train the facial recognition. And perfect. And there's a point, you can look this stuff up. That is a valid point. There's all these different movements.
I have to open my mouth.
God, it's creepy.
Oh my God. Terrifying.
And see, this is why we have to realize there's always multiple things happening, right? Obviously, the mask part of this was bigger than that, denied.
Well, and of course, because it was my cousin who set this up for me, I did not pass verification. I guess it's a good thing that the Chinese app is not racist. But now, I once
that's
again
what you're thinking about.
can't buy anything.
Right. So you're locked out of the system, right? But my point is, the mask part of it. I mean, obviously, I can prove that there was, and I'm going to do another focus on this at some point in the near future because it seems to be coming back again. But that bacterial pneumonia was the prominent part of what we saw, and if for especially people that believe it didn't happen at all, maybe all of it, combination of flu and bacterial pneumonia was all the point is you could prove today that a huge, just like the Spanish flu conversation, or rather the Kansas flu, the reality of it, was that it was largely bacterial pneumonia. And I can prove to you that wearing a mask the way that they told people to, in particular the cloth mask, which they forced on the vast majority and made that the case, guaranteed people were going to get bacterial pneumonia. That's a huge part of that, which then was fed into the system and was framed as coronavirus, or rather just long COVID or whatever else. So that's real. That's part of it. as well as keeping you in fear. But there's always multiple things happening. And I do believe it helped in regard to the facial recognition software. Now, here is an interesting point on this. The last point, I think, or 2 points. Senator Josh Hawley says, "You're doing a terrible job as Secretary of Homeland Security," to Alejandro Mayorkas in regard to the border. The way he responds is comically ridiculous. I mean, it is exactly what you might expect. Now, this is a point that I want to make sure just to include because we're talking about the border, and there's an overlap here to the next point. But remember this for another part we're going to get into in a minute. But here's what he actually says.
Mr. Secretary, I think that your performance is despicable. And I think the fact that you are not willing to provide answers to this committee is absolutely atrocious.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
If you'd like to have a minute to respond, you are welcome to.
I would, and I'm not sure I'll limit it to 60 seconds.
That's fine.
Oh, okay. Rules don't matter. Go ahead.
Number one, what I found despicable is the implication that this language, tremendously odious, actually it could be emblematic of the sentiments of the 260,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. Number one. Number two, Senator Hawley takes an adversarial approach to me in this question, and perhaps he doesn't know my own background.
Okay, before he says it. So you're telling me that he has an adversarial stance to you. He disagrees with your policy. Okay. So your argument is because of what you're about to say that that's not allowed?
Perhaps he does not know that I am the child of a Holocaust survivor.
Okay. Okay, so apparently we're not allowed to disagree with you because you have a family member of a Holocaust survivor. Does that make sense to anybody? I mean, not only is that clumsy, I mean, that's like right now, this whole kind of framing, which we're going to go into in a minute, is very clearly being broken down. You got Jews all over the world standing up and making the case about how this is why they're unsafe because of this perpetual victimhood that they use as Zionists to manipulate you. But interestingly, in zero context, talking about the border and how he's failing people in that regard, how dare you criticize me because my family was in the Holocaust. Like, I mean, all you did was further expose how ridiculous that is in any context. Why does it matter unless I'm saying something specifically about your heritage that should come up? I mean, my God, that's just that. I guess that's all he had.
Perhaps he does not know that my mother lost almost all her family at the hands of the Nazis. And so I find his adversarial tone to be entirely misplaced.
Look at his face too.
I find it.
I'm not a fan of Josh either, but he's just like, what are you saying? It's just mind-blowing to me. And of course, let's not forget that this is a man who is blindly supporting the open genocide being committed by the Israeli Zionist government, a group which I'll show you yet again, multiple times tried to align themselves with the very Nazis he's saying that his family was killed by. But that doesn't matter, of course, because, it's all about the narratives and the agendas today.
To be disrespectful of me and my heritage.
How was he disrespectful of your heritage?
And I do not expect an apology, but I did want to say what I just articulated. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just respond since he has referenced me personally?
Senator Hawley, we need to move on. Senator.
Yeah, I don't know. Move on. We know that's got to stand. I just think that's pretty embarrassing, quite frankly. Now, let's not forget, one of the groups that is discussed in the context of what's driving some of possibly a large portion of the migration is this group, HIAS. Now, what's interesting when I looked this group up, and I made this point before in another context, I was curious, who started this group, right? Well, that's always important. Where does the foundation come from? Who created it? The only thing I can find, and if you have more insight, I would love to know who individually actually created this, but you get this broad statement. More than 100 years ago, the Jewish community founded this group. And it's a Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. Now, how does that even make sense? So you mean at a time when Israel didn't even exist, you're telling me that the Jews of the world just kind of gathered together and were like, we're going to make this group about migration to the United States. Does that make sense? Obviously, that's some kind of an overview. To my honest opinion, this is a Zionist-founded group. And to always make it about the Jewish community to hide that element. That's my opinion. But how are you going to argue that the Jewish community at large founded this group? That doesn't make any sense to me. And the point is that Mayorkas is on the board of this group. Congratulations, board member Alejandro Mayorkas, for being on the Department of Homeland Security. So there's a lot of allegations about why he's failing there. Now, I don't want us to miss the overlap, as I keep pointing out, to why I think Israel is a very clear logical culprit here into what's going on if you think somebody's doing that. And I pointed out how the supposedly Azerbaijani terrorist that all the right-wing people were saying they caught at the border, or rather he made that weird video. Did we catch him? We had his name and his photo and his statements. And yeah, nobody's done anything about that. I wonder why. Probably because it turns out, as we showed the next day, that it was actually a Jordanian who was arrested in Egypt for recruiting for the Mossad. That's who that person was. And that's probably why no one talks about it anymore. And I think there's an obvious issue here to what Israel, just look at it like this. This is a topic that's been discussed a long time about Israel and the way that they're manipulating specifically migration in regard to the Middle East. And right now, people are accusing them of weaponized migration in regard to what they're doing with the Palestinian people. It's a clear tactic. Now, do you think they'd be capable of doing something like this in order to, one, create the narrative that Hamas is your threat too, number two, destabilize this country for its own purposes, which they've stated they're trying to accomplish, and number three, to threaten Biden and whoever else is slowly beginning to say you're doing the bad thing in Gaza, or you need to do more, or whatever. They're slowly pulling away from they're doing everything right. Those are just my personal opinions. Certainly could be China, but I'd love to see why you think that is, other than floated insinuations based on perceived, I see Chinese people, therefore this is probably, I don't, and I went over that last time. You guys can just think for yourselves. That's why I love you. But I think that obviously we need to stand with the facts and the body of evidence, and even then question whether that actually adds up. Now, we'll come back to that point about when we get to it further. I want to keep going with the concept of the biosurveillance, because that's really where I see most of this. And I loved Aaron, the True Stream Media's point about how that seems to be a central part of this. And most people aren't talking about that. This really blew me away. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it's almost on the nose what we've been floating and talking about. This anti-censorship, I wasn't familiar with the account. I feel like I've seen it before, but in any case, I'm not familiar with the work. They write, Bill Gates admits mRNA vaccines can self-assemble. Now, that's not exactly what he says. I'll play it for you. What he says is lipid nanoparticles, some of them can. So that doesn't necessarily imply that it's the current shot they're giving. But it's still just as relevant and important, I think. I'll just play it for you since the rest of he quotes it and the rest of it's his context. Here's what he says. And this is an interview with USA Today. Now, I should point out that anything online these days can be something altered or deep fakes or whatever else, but it appears to be a USA Today interview, and he's discussing this. And by the way, it is provable because I found other research showing you that this is the case.
Making the mRNA is really easy and really cheap, and that's the magic of this thing. But there's no doubt in the next 5 years, we can, we just need to mess around. There's a lot of lipid nanoparticles, and some are very self-assembling. There's no inherent reason.
Real quick, some are self-assembling.
And some are very self-assembling. There's no inherent reason it's not thermostable, it's not cheap, and it's not scalable. And so as over the 5 years, we fix that part of it, mature it, which is very typical, we'll be able to build factories worldwide that can make $2 vaccines with even less lead time than we've had to have here during this pandemic. And we'll use those, as you suggest. For every disease that we don't have vaccines, we will try mRNA. In fact, for HIV, we have multiple ways. One that's more of a B cell approach, one that's more of a T cell approach. For malaria, we have multiple ideas. For TB, we have multiple ideas.
Yeah, they're experimenting on you. I don't care how you hear that. Let me finish and let me hear the first thing he says again.
And so to fill in the missing vaccines,
missing or not existing,
we'll make a lot of our bets of the Gates Foundation and others who care about global health will be mRNA focused.
Of course they will, because that's the plan, like we told you. But again, listen to what he says first.
Making the mRNA is really easy and really cheap, and that's the magic of this thing. But there's no doubt in the next 5 years,
into it.
We can, we just need to mess around. Mess
around? Yeah. How do you not read that as experimentation and realize that that means they're still feeling this whole process out? And that's why when I referenced before the last, I think show before last, what Derek found in regard to disease X is it states it right in their discussion points that they chose to lean into this mRNA direction, even though it was completely undeveloped in the middle of what they claim was a big important pandemic, and then rushed that faster than ever. Does this sound like in your best interest for your safety? And now we can look back and see clearly not. In fact, we could see it right away. So it was an experiment. We must come to terms with that. Now, that's one part of it. There is a lot more going on there. But let's not forget, as I said, making it simple and easy. And well, Tesla teams up with CureVac to make RNA microfactories for that very purpose, according to Elon Musk. Just continuing to show you that this is very clearly an overlap. But considering this in the context of self-assembling nanoparticles, one of which you could talk about graphene oxide, but realizing that this is not a new concept. Quantum dots go back to, there's an article I'll show you from 1997. So this is why I keep talking about how they've been working on, especially theoretically, a lot of this stuff, and we've come to a point where the technology has met what they've wanted to accomplish. Now, this is self-assembled mRNA vaccines. This was written in March of 2021. So my concern about this, and you'll see as we get into the points about the biosurveillance, is that this is something that overlaps with the work that I've shown you about internal biosurveillance. Now, you can ask whether this is something that's already been done, but that's up for you to decide. I quite frankly think that's highly likely. That's my opinion. But my point is just simply to show you that this is real and the work is being done and it could be next, right? The reality of what they're actually putting forward. This writes, in 2021, mRNA vaccines showed spectacular success in the race for COVID-19. Yeah, they're still saying that. Yes, it's 2021, but they still make that argument. 95% spectacular success. They changed the world. I mean, they're just screaming what they want to be the reality while people are still dying because of these dangerous gene therapy experimental shots. Self-assembled mRNA delivery vectors include lipid and polymer nanoparticles. Just so it's clear that the lipid nanoparticles in these shots could very well be exactly this problem. Lipid nanoparticle mRNA vaccines have a 95% efficacy, they say. Do they? These unprecedented results may pave the road for future mRNA vaccine development. It says, in this review, we discussed design and self-assembly of mRNA vaccines. So I'm going to come to it next so you understand what these really are, right? So quantum dots in particular, but just self-assembling. We're talking about things that we just talked about the idea of the platform concept, whether we're talking about mRNA platforms or specifically like building something or taking an injection that sort of primes your body for what they'll next ask it to do, right? Or this clip that I've played many, many times, and this is what this is really about. Every day, this becomes more and more relevant.
Wall Street and biotechnology companies have been very excited about this idea. And what essentially it is trying to hack the cells in the body in order to make them into drug factories.
Right. That's what this is in one part anyway. Right. So the idea would be that you prime your body with a certain setup and then you later trigger it to achieve certain things. In the context of the vaccine world and the health conversation, we'll trigger it to make the new vaccine and the new protein or whatever else we can do with this same technology. That's the point. They've highlighted this in one way that clearly is hurting people, but it's so much bigger than that clearly they can't give up. That's how I see that, right? Otherwise, how do you explain how they're just mindlessly pushing forward in the field where everyone seems to quietly know, even the ones that went along with it, that this is a bad thing and you shouldn't touch it? Remember, they've dropped out. Nobody seems to be taking the new shots either. So these quantum dots are specifically just self-assembling nanoparticles are about things that can be inserted, that can then assemble in certain ways, and especially even if there's other materials that are internally in your body that can be compiled. It's probably the not right best word for it, but can be utilized to assemble what they might want to assemble. And that's simplified, but that's ultimately what we're talking about. And it says a spontaneous organization of individual molecules allows for design of nanoparticles with customizable properties. mRNA vaccines, and again, this is in the context of vaccines. Now you could read that as making up what you need to make to immunize you or whatever else it could do. mRNA vaccines are ready for the clinic, it says, showing tremendous promise. Get this, I love this. It says, in the COVID vaccine race, and have pushed the boundaries of gene therapy. Oops. I guess they didn't get the memo that we're supposed to lie about that, right? Obviously, these are gene therapy, and everyone knows that at this point, who's being honest, especially since other companies have acknowledged that, but they still pretend like that's a conspiracy theory with the high-minded circles of the corporate media and people that blindly watch CNN and Fox News. Here's what it says down here. The delicate nature of mRNA imposes a limitation on its storage and the administration of the treatment. Second, which, by the way, shows you why they, in many cases could have even just by accident hurt people. Second, precise identification of antigen, in this case, the spike protein or the different variants they want you to take, is crucial in altering the course of the disease. Inappropriate antigen sequences may cause undesired activation of the immune system. Oh, you don't say. Exactly what we've always been telling you. So you mean when you take a shot for the thing that's not currently circulating, that may cause undesired outcomes? Yeah. And you guys, we've been saying this for so damn long, and you can show them saying this too, right? That they knew this, that if you take the wrong thing at the wrong time, it can cause things like antibody-dependent enhancement, all sorts of problems.
There's another element to safety, and that is if you vaccinate someone and they make an antibody response and then they get exposed and infected, does the response that you induce actually enhance the infection and make it worse? And
they're trying to train the body's immune system to target the right part of the virus because getting it wrong can be dangerous.
We know that historically with coronaviruses, that if you do vaccinate with the wrong kind of vaccine, for instance in domestic cats who have a similar viral infection, that you can make the disease more severe.
All right, so they knew that, right? And we tried to tell you, and we showed you the antibody-dependent enhancement peer-reviewed study that said it was important and significant, and we need to tell everybody we're not meeting informed consent, and they still hid it from you. And even in their own science, it was going, we have to be specific, and we can't give you a shot for the wrong thing. It's so crazy how obvious this is. And we see things like lymphocytopenia and the complete collapse of your immune system, and we're baffled. The term self-assembly, it goes on, refers to a spontaneous arrangement of individual molecules into a supramolecular assembly. Supramolecular assembly driven by non-covalent interactions. This approach is extremely attractive in the development of smart materials. Exactly my point. Since the properties of individual building blocks may fine-tune the properties of the constructs, and the perception may be done by simple mixing of the components. Meaning that this can actually compose these things if it's got the elements internally. And the point about smart materials, this is exactly the point about smart dust and smart networks and the internet of bio-nano things. And we're talking about this through the context of vaccination, guys. The vast majority of the non-viral vectors for mRNA delivery are currently prepared through self-assembly, which includes a large fraction of mRNA vaccines. Now, you could take that as meaning the ones that are being given. You get to decide for yourselves. In this review, we highlight the recent advances in the design of mRNA vaccines and the implementation of self-assembly in their preparation. So this is real. And you can go through, I think there was some, maybe it's the other one, some interesting diagrams and so on, showing you this stuff. Either way, guys, I mean, this is quite literally what I was concerned about. Now, here's some other, just showing you the studies. This is 2021, lipid nanoparticles from liposomes to mRNA vaccine delivery, a landscape research, diversity and advancement. Self-assembled nanostructured lipid systems. Is there a link between structure and cytotoxicity? Yeah, there is. We know that, but they don't want you to know that. Nanoparticles self-assembly within lipid biolayers. Self-assembling protein nanoparticles in the design of vaccines. So it's slightly different. My point in that one is to show you that it's bigger than even just lipid nanoparticles. We've talked about the protein side of it, right? And I'll grab this one. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that is the right one. The other one down there is about I'll grab that too. This one. But here's the one I was going to point out, and I've talked about this. This is an important show. Genetically engineered proteins to control everything. That goes deep on the concept of the ferritin nanoparticle concept, right? So that overlaps with both of these things. And this one was simply about, and this is actually overlapping with that same topic, but the current shot, by the way, that is already in trials, the deadly lipid nanoparticle spike protein design, that's already happening, and the new modRNA ferritin nanoparticle universal flu injection. These are currently in the process of being given to people. So God only knows what that's unleashing in the population, or maybe it's the second step, and who ultimately knows. And actually, I'm going to grab this one too, since I already kind of mentioned this. And this is simply about the reality of smart dust. To understand that this is long ago, decades ago, was something that was already in use. And my point was, knowing that, was COVID-19 or whatever that was, and the administration of these nanoparticle shots, gene therapy, an attempted experimental next step? I'm rapidly feeling that's the case. This is actually really interesting. This one is from 2019. Immunogenicity of RNA replicons encoding HIV immunogens designed for self-assembly into nanoparticles. What? So we've seen all these HIV overlaps. That seems really strange to me. These are encoding HIV immunogens that are designed for self-assembly into nanoparticles. That's pretty, it almost sounds like a weapon. But this is where it becomes important. This is the point. Actually, I swear I had, that's what I did. I don't know why that's at the end. Well, I think I already explained it for the most part. This is the one I said, 1997. Self-assembled quantum dots. And I'll come back to that in a sec. Actually, that's why I moved it back there, to show you who is involved with that. But first, this is genetic engineering, biotechnology news. Quantum dots deliver vaccines and invisibly encode vaccination history in the skin. So quantum dots are an example of self-assembling nanotech. Delivering vaccines. So you could talk about this in the context of tracking information or relaying information, which is what they discussed. In this case, you could use the self-assembling nanotech to deliver vaccines, and then in the process of that, invisibly encode your vaccination history on your skin. You remember this, right? For those that think, that weird conspiracy site, well, here's MIT. So you don't dismiss it. Maybe you still will. Storing medical information below the skin surface. We've talked about this. This is 2019, guys. Remember this? The quantum dot tattoo, and that's what they called it. So it says, MIT researchers have now developed a novel way to record a patient's vaccination history, storing the data in a pattern of dye invisible to the naked eye that is delivered under the skin at the same time as the vaccine. Now, that's the, again, surface level health context. But you must realize that what we're talking about are self-assembling nanoparticles that don't necessarily have to be what this is, as well as the fact that this could be information for use in a lot of other ways, or as well as relaying information. It's not just about the simple way it's framed. It says the researchers showed that their new dye, which consists of nanocrystals called quantum dots, which even then really downplays what that actually is and what it's capable of, can remain for at least 5 years under the skin, where it emits near infrared light that can be detected by a specially equipped smartphone, in one very specific context and how it's used. McHugh and former visiting scientist Li-Hong Jing are the lead authors of this study, which appears in the Science Translational Medicine. Anna Jaklenick, a research scientist at MIT's Koch Institute for Investigative Cancer Research, and Robert Langer are the senior authors of the paper. So Robert Langer, who is the academic co-founder of Moderna, and one of in my opinion, one of the key foundational researchers in all the stuff we're talking about, now, not my opinion, it's a provable fact, is one of the key researchers in the direction of quantum dots. And I've talked about his other companies that go in that same direction. I think it was, I'm going to forget off the top of my head. I want to say Alanis, but I forget. So showing you that Robert Langer, of all people, who, this is a discussion I had with Whitney Webb, Bob Langer, the coronavirus common denominator, who has direct ties to Charles Lieber, who is the other foundational part of this research, was literally working on this right before the COVID-19 conversation. Now, again, this is 1997. Self-assembled quantum dots. The greatest success in semiconductor lasers has been brought by the ability to artificially structure new materials on an atomic scale. So my point in this one, like you can see over here, we're talking about using them to create, illuminescence and tracking for data, but on your skin. The same quantum dots can, in this case, be used in semiconductor lasers, right? Because the ability is that they can artificially structure new materials. So you understand, this is limitless. And to frame it only as some tracking on your skin is to not understand what this really is, right? It's self-assembling nanotechnology that can artificially structure new materials on an atomic scale by using advanced crystal growth methods such as, they list, acronyms off. Just think about what that could be applied to damn near everything as far as I can tell. Oh, and by the way, just in case you didn't want to take my word for it, I've said it many times. There's Moderna. There's Robert Langer, academic co-founder of Moderna. That's important, right? Seeing as how he is one of these central players in a lot of this very concerning internal biosurveillance work, along with Charles Lieber, and yet as well as the stuff that we talk about that's concerning about what's in these injections. And here he is as the co-founder of this very, and even then, by the way, you can argue that it seems like a weird deviation from his work to suddenly be working on vaccines. But here it is in 2020. Quantum dots as a promising agent to combat COVID-19. See my point? Like, this is just a broad, universal concept that's being used in a lot of different ways. This is, in 2020, applications of specifically graphene quantum dots, because that's one of the aspects of the self-assembling discussion. Make sure I didn't have anything highlighted here. I think it's these last two that I really went into. And this one is quantum dots in biomedical sensors. So these things, the point is that these things can be utilized in any way, ultimately. So this is something like when George Webb and I talked about the oil drilling platform, and we're waiting for the drill itself, right? So that you could read these things as ready, and other aspects that are being given to you in other ways, maybe being sprayed in the air, whatever else, are things that the materials might be needed. It's all completely hypothetical how it's being used. These things are real. And then you trigger that to achieve whatever end. Think of it like that. Applications of the graphene quantum dots in biomedical sensors, so literally internal biosurveillance. This is graphene-based sensors for human health monitoring. Exactly the same point. Now, the difference would be whether that is being relayed outside of your body, which ultimately it has to be able to get the information, but people would read this as you wearing a wearable, let's say, and being able to get that info. But it's really no different, just simply being altered in a way to be able to relay that information. And we've talked about the smart dust aspect. You really should watch this if you haven't seen this, to show you how far back this goes and how two-way communication outward. I mean, Charles Lieber in 2011 wrote about his virus-sized transistor and how that was capable of two-way communication. Today, it's talking about far, far, far more concerning things, not just the biosurveillance being relayed out to whatever place they're in, but the capability of manufacturing proteins that could be used to then influence, as Giordano is his name, I believe, the neuroscience expert, talks about how they're actively trying to achieve, to be able to influence what you think and feel and even what you can do. Here is one entitled from 2019, Graphene-Based Wearables for Health Monitoring, Food Inspection, Night Vision. Hybrid quantum dot and graphene wearable sensor for systemic hemodynamics and hydration monitoring. So you can see how all of this is very clearly related to data flow, internal and out and external surveillance. So my big concern about all of this is whether this is already in effect. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This is I believe this was 2015. Yeah, 2015. This is the title of this draft, this PDF is Corona, a coordinate and routing system for nano networks. Get that. Literally called Corona. As it says, I think I have these highlighted. I'll read this abstract first. The present paper introduced a joint coordinate and routing system, otherwise known as Corona, which can be deployed dynamically on a 2D ad hoc nano network. 2015. User-selected nodes are used as anchor points. So read basically, internal, your body, and the nanotechnology as anchor points as the setup phase. All nodes then measure their distances in a number of hops, which is the term they use. And from these anchors, using these hops, they're able to obtain a sense of geolocation. Isn't that interesting? At operation phase, the routing employs the appropriate subset of anchors selected. I think that was mostly it. So here, let's see, keywords, introduction right here. Wireless networking, nanoscale. It says advances in nanotechnology enable. Now, and by the way, just to get a frame, I know that sometimes these PDFs make it look like it's old. In 2011, Charles Lieber, actually, I'll just grab it so you can see that. Publicized from Harvard his virus-sized transistor, which is exactly what it sounds like. Microscopic, like nanoscale, in 2011, and even utilized the lipid nanoparticle technology. That's what we're talking about. using a hairpin nanowire with fatty lipid layer to be able to insert it into the cell, talking about how when things are the size of even when technology is the size of biology, it acts like biology, which is very interesting. So the point here is in 2015, this is what we're talking about. Working with virus-sized transistors that can two-way communicate. And this is talking about this internal aspect of this. So just consider that. Advances in nanotechnology enable the development of tiny machines from nanoscale components, namely nanomachines, composed of a power supply, a memory, an antenna, and a CPU module. These are tiny nanoscale concepts. Nanomachines are entirely autonomous nodes which are able to perform simple operations and communicate in short distances. I mean, you could really read this as smart dust, but I think it's bigger than that. Currently, miniature graphene-based antennas are introduced, giving nanomachines the ability to achieve high transmission rates over very short distances while operating in the most promising operating spectrum of terahertz band. Such networks are expected to be, now, and this is where you overlap with the 5G concept. Such networks are expected to be widely deployed in a variety of fields, such as biomedicine, industry, environment, and military. Yeah, what happened? It's 2024. We're almost 10 years later. What happened? Did it get used? Why'd they stop talking about it? I think you know why. I think we really need to reflect on how obvious that is. They're screaming about how this is going to change everything. It's the most promising direction. And all of what we're talking about today overlaps with nanotechnology, biomedicine, all of it. And yet, nothing until COVID-19, people didn't even understand what was this. Nothing was being talked about. The only reason I think we're even talking about a lot of this stuff is because we were forced to learn about it because of what the COVID-19 shot was. My point is, guys, it has to be in use, smart dust level. That's why I'm worried about what's flowing through our blood right now. And I know that scares people. No conspiracy theory. People for a long time have talked about things like the Morgellons and the structures. That's what this is meant to do. The self-assembling nanotechnology creates these structures. That's the whole point. I don't know whether that's not real or whether that's part, but the point is that theoretically, that's exactly what we're talking about. Communication among nanomachines is evolving in the direction of ad hoc networks due to their characteristics, the ability to reconfigurable and reorganize. However, the severe restrictions of nanonodes in terms of computational power, memory, and energy, combined with the expected high number of nanonodes per network, give rise to different protocol and networking design issues. Next one was related work. It says nano networking. And again, from this point, think like the meshing concept I'm always talking about. The internet of bio-nano things and being able to mesh and connect the networks between your body and the nanotech within your body or wherever else it is. That's all what this is about. Nano networking has become a topic of research interest in different fields in general. Two main trends can be distinguished: the biological or bio-inspired communication modules and the wireless electromagnetic communication. That's exactly this is what I'm talking about. Now, you could see that as something benign, or you can really begin to recognize how surreptitious the development of all of this has been, and it becomes kind of impossible not to see that there's something else behind all of this. The first relies on biology as a source of inspiration and exploits biological modules as information carriers. Didn't we just talk about utilizing your body, your DNA, all of this as a way to store information? This stuff is this is where I think that we're beyond where most of us are even grasping right now. For example, it says the information is encoded on several biological molecules, like RNA, which are diffused to the environment. The latter trend, which is assumed in the present work, relies on radiative transfer theory, where wireless communication is based on electromagnetic waves. Related research efforts so far have been focused on the physical and medium access control, MAC definition, where the driving factor of research is the energy efficiency. Now, remember, we talked about the presentation about smart dust and how the DARPA version was already made to run on your body's own energy. At the physical layer, early studies show that electromagnetic communication in the terahertz band is the most promising approach. Yeah, exactly. The development of an antenna at nanoscale while keeping it operating frequency at this promising operation spectrum is proposed to be accomplished by the use of the new extraordinary material called graphene. In carbon, plasmonic and nano antennas, the propagation speed of the electromagnetic waves can be up to 2 orders of magnitude lower than in classical materials. I just find that to be, this is kind of what I was just saying. The new and promising, extraordinary thing that's going to change everything, and then nobody talks about it ever again. Why? Joint coordinating right here. It says this is joint coordinate routing for nanonetworks, or Corona. It says this section presents the proposed approach to address geographic routing in nanonetworks. First, we present the technique for assigning address in a nanonetwork in the form of a coordinate system. So that's your body. Each nanomachine derives its own coordinates dynamically during the process. This addressing information assigned to each nanomachine may be unique. Instead, it may be, or may not be unique. Instead, it may be shared by all nodes in the same area. We will then present the routing scheme operation on top of the aforementioned addressing. Now, I think this did have some interesting graphics, I thought. Maybe it's the other one. Yeah, I guess not. Yeah, I think that was the point for the most part. And then lastly, on conclusion, it says, the present study introduced a joint coordinate and routing system for trustworthy nano networks. Corona uses distances from user-selected anchor points to define arc-shaped paths among a pair of nodes. These paths were shown to efficiently serve point-to-point communication needs, while reducing considerably the number of required packets retransmissions, promoting energy efficient in highly restricted nano environments. I just think this is quite literally exactly what we're talking about. Let me include that for you. Oops, close that. So this is the same point, really, just showing you this on an actual, this is Semantic Scholar, coordinate for routing system for nano networks. Same thing here, but I found this interesting. I was looking at the cited documents within this discussion. And this one reads a lot. All these are pretty interesting, though. Robust hybrid model with low energy consumption for biosensor nano networks. This one says, and this was the Internet of Things, wireless telecommunications. This says toward the Internet of Meta Material Things. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that new one. This is talking about the Internet of Meta Material Things and their software enablers. It's just another, and this is 2020. It's just sort of another angle to a similar conversation. It says the new paradigm called the Internet of Meta Material Things, and it's all these same acronyms. Like, this is a weird, there's a lot of this popping up, is introduced in this paper where artificial materials with real-time tunable physical properties can be interconnected to form a network to realize communication through software-controlled electromagnetic, acoustic, and mechanical energy waves. So this seems to me, if I'm reading this correctly, to be the specific Internet of Meta Material Things that applies to the artificially created concepts and materials made by the self-assembling nanotech. So it's like the next step after the Internet of Bio-Nano Things to being the specific internet between the things that those things create. I mean, this stuff is just so ridiculous. And this is 2020. I mean, if you talk about this stuff in circle, people will think you're ridiculous. You're crazy. Even though I think we're beyond this stuff at this point. This is 2019, which gets into the larger point, and I think that's what all this is about. An energy balance clustering routing protocol for intra-body wireless nanosensor networks, right? So this is 2015 with the Corona network. This is 2019, just like the extension of this same work, right before the beginning of the COVID-19 illusion. Wireless nanosensor networks, or WNSNs, are a new type of network that combines nanotechnology and the sensor network, because I don't want to keep repeating that. The WNSNs, the wireless nanosensor networks, have great application prospects in the intra-body health monitoring. Biomedicine, damage detection, intra-body wireless nanosensor networks have become a new research hotspot, except they got real quiet after that. The nano nodes in the cluster can transmit data directly to the cluster head node, same point, by one hop, same information, same terminology, and the cluster head nodes can transmit data to the nano control node by multi-hop routing among themselves. So read this as like a central location. to develop the development of new materials such as graphene and carbon nanotubes that can work at the terahertz frequencies opens new opportunities for applying these nano devices to the body. This underutilized terahertz spectrum will have a major impact on future medical technologies. So we were told, but then it got real distant, and they told it was conspiracy theory. First, it can provide a wide bandwidth, and the antenna size can be made small. Second, it is less sensitive to propagation effects such as scattering, and is relatively safe for biological tissues. Relatively. Therefore, terahertz wireless communication is an ideal choice for the wireless nanosensor networks, physical layer technology. That's why we're jamming out 5G with no concern for the overlap, because they're building something, guys. Just get along with it. But the thing for me, I think you could read this as just a scientific group trying to figure out how this works, right? It may be completely independent from what the government may decide to achieve or experiment on based on what this is finding, right? So you can ask whether there's, I think it's been definitively proven that there is a residual amount of graphene oxide based on the testing process, as I think the expose proved, that they even write in their documentation is residual. So it is technically in there. Does that mean there's not more of it? I don't know, but the evidence doesn't seem to support it. The claims in the beginning of 99% clearly don't seem to be true as far as I can tell. So that means to me exactly what we first thought, that those people came out ahead of this to muddy the waters of something that is very real by making it a bombastic claim and made even people like me more hesitant to talk about it. No, I shouldn't say that. I talked about it quite a bit, but more hesitant to feel that it was actually possible. This one. Solving generic decision problems by in-message computation in DNA-based molecular nano networks. This is the next year, 2020. One of the biggest, actually, I think this is World 2020, right? Yeah, no, this is 2019. This one's 2020. One of the biggest unsolved problems in nano network research is the, interestingly enough, actual construction of the components required for building these networks. Well, guess what solves that? Self-assembling nanobots. Most existing ideas are limited to partial solutions of construction of nano devices, computation within them, and communication between them. While many ideas are promising, the problem remains how to combine those various building blocks. Well, it seems to be that you create them internally. In this paper, they use DNA as the basic building block for all components of nano networks. Okay, well, maybe this DNA contamination wasn't really contamination at all. The inherent properties of this molecule are used to assemble complex nanostructures. Okay, that becomes really interesting. So you can wonder whether or not this was something that was actually designed in a way to give the building materials for what this wanted to accomplish. These are all just thoughts. But obviously, what we're reading it from is peer-reviewed science and real, actual work. It says, in this paper, we use DNA as the building blocks. The inherent properties of this molecule are used to assemble complex nanostructures. Exactly, to a T, what we're talking about. DNA can be utilized to create both nano devices and a communication mechanism. I mean, really? Properly designed DNA molecules can even be utilized for computational purposes. In summary, DNA forms the base for an exhaustive nano network concept. I mean, come on. I'm not, so it very well may, but maybe the contamination was just a mistake. And these are other things, in other ways these will be added. But doesn't that seem a little bit hard to miss? Flexible graphene assembled film-based antenna for wireless wearable sensors with miniaturized size and highly, this is 2020. This is one that Orwell shared with me. Recent development in nano antennas. The title is Nano Communication for Biomedical Applications. A review of the state-of-the-art from physical layers to novel network concepts. Now, this is, where's the date on there? Oh, sorry, 2016. So this point is interesting about, antennas were mentioned numerous times in what I was just reading. Oh, and then this is the one that has some pretty interesting graphics, where you can literally see what they're talking about. Internet of Nano Things, right there, showing you your body's connection to the internet through your phone. I mean, it's 2016. And if we brought this up in 2016, you'd be laughed away like you were crazy. In most circles, anyway. And this is interesting. I think I was going to come down and show you this. Showing you that This is what they're talking about in certain circumstances. But then come down here. I mean, look at how tiny this stuff is. Look at that. This is smart dust level stuff, guys. Technically, if we're talking about virus-sized transistors, you wouldn't be able to see it on your finger either, right? But that's still that's still nanotechnology. So it's all these different levels that people don't want to engage with. But to the antenna part, right, here, past it. Recent development in nano antennas. It says, despite numerous studies on nanotechnology are being published every year, enabling the communication between nano devices is apparently a major challenge, which is mainly, so they say anyway, mainly related to the development of nano antennas and the corresponding electromagnetic transceiver. Reducing the size of the traditional antenna down to a few hundreds of nanometers could lead to extremely high operating frequencies. It's saying, which compromises the feasibility of the wireless communication nano devices. It can be either made of conventional material, metal, novel materials like carbon nanotubes, graphene. This section is dedicated to give the brief description of those two types of nano antennas. Now, the point, as I feel like I had another highlighted image, but I don't want to take too much time on it, was ultimately that you can talk about how this could, as just to take right from what Orwell said, that they're turning your body into an antenna, which is not new. I mean, this is something we've talked about for a long time in regard to these, even just the Internet of Nano Things or utilizing your body for other types of technology they've talked about for a long time. Yeah, I don't want to we're already quite long today in general for what I want to get to next. But the point ultimately is just one more example of how they're talking about utilizing the biological aspects overlapping with nanotechnology to create their communication system. And your body and different aspects, including your devices, are acting as antennas for this system and the relaying of information, including internal biosurveillance. This is entitled Graphene Field Effect Transistors for In Vitro and Ex Vivo Recordings. Just to continue to show you, this is about transmitting information. And then lastly, on this point, this is coming from ETSI, which is the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, supports the development of testing of global technical standards and was set up in 1988 by the European Conference of Postal and Telecommunications Administrations following a proposal by the European Commission. So it's talking about smart body area networks or smart band. 2015, unified data representation formats. Down here it says, I think that was and this was one of the other ones as well. Look at these images, guys. 2015. Wearable, implantable. I mean, it's already written right there. Like, this was planned out, guys. Remote control monitoring centers. Right? These are the locations, and your body is relaying that information, as well as the fact to other bodies is what they talk about. This is the meshing and the networking we're talking about. Now, it says in the introduction, the present document gives the high-level description of a unified data format providing one of the building blocks for heterogeneity management in smart bands. So, in body networks. The present document will, in particular, define the unified description model. And I think that was, wireless body area networks. So there's W bands, then there's smart band, right? So that's the next step, are made of a collection of low power embedded devices, mainly sensors or actuators that are used for monitoring vital data of a human and its environment, but not limited to humans. Now, the point is they take the step from there and talk about the smart level aspect of this. And this goes a long way back. It's weird also that I don't even think we've talked a lot about the smart device aspect of this or the smart cities. All this is kind of weirdly drifted away from the conversation. Yeah, I think the point is quite clear, and I think what I don't want to take too much more time on this. Here's one of the main parts. It says, first, a W band shall be identified by its W band that shall be unique and accessible by any authorized user. It is developed, and realize this is like a system. It's like being on the internet. It's not something that the identified concept here is about your bodies as antennas and the overlapping relaying of the smart network. And in this case, being, as we talked about before as well, the geolocation part of it, but the identifiable Think of it like a digital ID concept, accessible by any authorized user. It is deployed on the human body or implanted in the body, 2015. Thus, the location of the W-band, when available and needed, shall be given relatively to the one of the human body that can refer to the location of the patient wearing the W-band or which is implanted. This is what we're talking about. So I really think this is an important conversation about where this stuff is going, or rather where I think it already is, and we have yet to fully catch up. So please just give this its full consideration. Now let's talk about Iran before we kind of skim through some of the final points here. So I don't, I guess 3 hours is the number these days. Al Jazeera, U.S. vows more attacks against Iran-linked groups. That was today. Seriously, after everything that's being discussed, we vow more attacks, which I'm actually willing to bet you, and I'm pretty good at predicting their inaction or action or feeble responses, that nothing will happen. Not until more goes, this is about acting like we're in the process of, and it's really just about, narrative control. They just bombed PMU, which is not Iran, in multiple locations they were illegally occupying, acting like that's some kind of a deterrence. It's just this stomping around, being clumsy, and then vowed to attack more. Iraq, I think this was, today as well. Iraq spoke up and said, by the way, the U.S. government killed civilians when they bombed. Oops. So very clearly was not this coordinated, targeted, only Iran-backed military. You bombed a bunch of locations where there's people that are in these countries, and I think you just told us what you wanted us to think happened. Which, by the way, is exactly the case because it's not Iran. You bombed actual parts of the Iraqi military, which, by the way, get armed by them in many cases, which means you give things to Iraq, which then goes to them, and you're fighting them because that's really ridiculous. The Iraqi prime minister declares 3 days of mourning because of the civilians that were killed by U.S. airstrikes. But they respect their sovereignty, don't they? Now, Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur, makes a point about this, and this is this rhetoric. I mean, I align this with like the way that they were talking about the border, the Alex Jones clip. Right, but this is from a government level in regard to foreign policy. The same thing is their rhetoric is so irresponsible. In fact, it's clear that they either are so wildly uninformed that they're spreading dangerous misinformation, which again is their right to free speech, but we can acknowledge it as being so dangerous because he's in a position of authority, or he's knowingly spreading this because it's about controlling the narrative, or rather driving you in a certain direction. But let's listen to what he says first, and I'll read you what she says. But this guy is driving people in the direction of bombing Iran because that's the deterrence.
Is suggesting starting World War III.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
Well, no, but that's where it would end up.
Well, I mean, no, I don't think it is. I mean, everybody said the same thing. When Trump endorsed the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the commentariat said World War III is coming, and World War III didn't come because of effective deterrent.
No, it was not, in fact, because what they did was actually respond that time, and it wasn't immediately, and they bombed the base, which ended up being thousands of traumatic brain injuries, because that's ridiculous. Clearly, people died, and they covered that up. Well, so how is that a deterrent? And in fact, they've even said other responses they've had within that have been because of Soleimani. The point is, maybe they didn't start World War III, but that's only because of Iran's restraint in deciding not to be as belligerent as the U.S. government is, or Israel, and act wildly outside of that's not a deterrence when you bomb in like what they did. You bombed locations that aren't Iran and killed people in countries you're occupying, and did it multiple times, and you just yelled deterrence. In no way is it a deterrence. Anybody when dealt with that kind of a hit is going to want to respond. They know that, though. That's the whole point. But what he's saying is that by bombing Iran, it will stop them somehow. These people want war, or they're that stupid.
And that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a large-scale invasion. I'm talking about pinpoint strikes that are going to make them sit up and take notice.
But you don't know that it will.
Or they're going to sit up and take notice. I mean, you realize that they're publicly saying they will respond. They're saying, we will bomb. If you do this, war will begin. And he's going, they'll stand back. We'll bomb them, and they'll say, whoa, they have missiles like we do, so we'll stop. Again, he's either that stupid, or he is clearly trying to drive an agenda.
Past the point until
what we do know is that if we carry on going how we're going, it's only going to get worse.
That's because your actions are driving the problem. If you were to back away from your illegal occupations and terror campaigns, then it wouldn't go forward.
Iran is escalating and escalating and escalating.
No, it's not. I mean, think about how crazy that is to argue that Iran is the one continuing to escalate. What you're watching is this back and forth between the PMU and the U.S. while the U.S. pretends they're dealing with Iran. That's really what you're watching. It's embarrassing. And everyone seems to know that except people like him.
And without actually enforcing a proper deterrent, that's only going to go one way. And so sometimes easy decisions don't get you anywhere. You've got to take a harder decision to enforce a proper deterrent to put a stop to this.
Okay, we're going to leave it.
God, and this, I mean, that's just like old school neocon talking points. Oops, I was closing some of these. Let me just do it since we're here. Oh, okay, we're good. So, bomb Iran, because that will stop everything, right? When's the last time bombing an adversary in their country stopped more aggression? Like maybe say, and quite frankly, you could say maybe like nuclear bombs in Japan. But remember, that didn't actually stop anything. From that forward, we've seen the most ongoing war in living memory at the very least, obviously. The point is that the U.S. government then was like, perfect, we'll be belligerent. We'll do whatever we want all the time. And they have. Here's what Francesca says. I'm deeply troubled by remember, she's a UN rapporteur, deeply troubled by the overt public advocacy for targeted assassinations, which is what Lindsey Graham is saying. It's what, even Alex Jones spoke up. Oh, I think I have that in here. No, it was yesterday, but they have comments in here. But it said, they attacked us, so it's justified, kind of a thing. No, they didn't, man. They did not. You're in occupied territory. They are occupying illegally in Syria or Iraq. So any part of the resistance that chooses to resist with guns or otherwise is legally protected under international law. The only action that's illegal is the presence of the U.S. government in an illegal base in Syria where they steal from the country and continue to bomb them or allow Israel to do whatever they want. And yet this insider it doesn't matter. I just don't know why people can't see that people that still listen to these commentators that don't recognize you're literally cheering on the war machine while acting like you're fighting it. That makes a lot of sense. But she goes on to say these actions should not be normalized as they are extrajudicial executions like Soleimani, violating the right to life, presumption of innocence, and state sovereignty. Why do media tolerate these talks and speakers? Because that's their job, to push these narratives. Now, Primo Radical says, boy, it sure is weird how Elon Musk, Alex Jones, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, AOC, MGT, and every other anti-establishment, dissident voice has virtually nothing negative to say about Israel's war crimes, nor a foreign government's demonstrable influence over U.S. policy. Strange. He's making an obvious point, right? That these people, they're either choosing not to look at it or aren't able to discern that clear reality. Factor that into who you choose to listen to, guys. RFK, with David Smith podcast that's been circulating, where he point blank asked him, do you not see undue influence from Israel and our government? He paused for 7 seconds and then was, I don't know. Yeah, that's a pretty weak answer, man. You damn well do. And clearly something's stopping you from saying that. David Icke points out, why would somebody who is a, quote, threat to the system be paid $250 million by the system to broadcast on mainstream internet platforms owned by the system? The naivety is shocking. So many who think they are awake are really still in a coma. Joe Rogan signs a new Spotify deal worth $250 million to spread his podcast across multiple platforms and so on. Now, quite frankly, out of everyone that we're talking about, and that he lists off in this next one, as well as this one, of all of them, I think Joe Rogan is the least problematic, but I do agree that this is still a system that is allowing this. So we should be very skeptical of how that's being channeled and how that's driving certain narratives and so on. But I agree with him completely, especially with these larger, you know what it is actually, now that I really think about it, that Joe is far less partisan than most of these people. And the two-party paradigm, in my opinion, is the most obvious problem of everything we're dealing with. But he also, David Icke goes on to say, Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, Eva, I forget how to say her last name, Vladimir, the one in regard to, I think, the farming discussion, and the rest of the Musk-worshipping group. She says, when are you going to wake the F up and see what this man really is? Oh, and the point is he's referencing what I talked about, where he says, the only action needed to solve the climate crisis is a carbon tax. And he really did say that. There's an entire video right here. He shows you where he is talking about it. which shocking to me that that's not. Anyway, he goes on to say, I despair at your naivety, and I'm being optimistic that it is all naivety. Here, he is making exactly the World Economic Forum case for a carbon tax that Schwab and Gates have long demanded, using the same arguments about the climate change hoax. And all his companies, in quotes, his companies, are advancing the cult agenda for global dystopia. We've shown you the list of the check boxes for everything WEF that he's completely aligned with. SpaceX, Neuralink, Tesla, he writes, even the tunnel building boring company. But still, you lick his arse, he says, and call him the biggest maverick in the last 500 years. That's a direct quote, because he promotes you on Twitter, X, while seriously shadow banning those with the intelligence to call him out for what he's actually doing. Wherever you look, he says, including his support for a universal basic income and the promotion of an AI takeover hidden behind his fake concern, he is pushing everything the World Economic Forum and the global cult wants to happen. There was no alternative media when David Icke says, I'm reading from him, when I started, he's speaking for himself, out in 1990. I watched it appear and grow, and now you are destroying it with your pathetic submission to this blatant asset of the very global cult that you claim to oppose. Man, kind of hard not to agree with that. What I think is hilarious is down here, Alex Jones says, David, I've invited you on the last 5 times of the month to talk about Musk, and I'm saying whatever I want on X, and that's a good thing. Just towing that. I mean, if you can't acknowledge that he's not saving free speech and he's clearly continuing to censor, well, Max Egan, so many people that are still censored on this platform, and yet that's the response. I think if he's your friend, so, it says, feel free to keep calling me out for being happy with Elon's actions, but at least come on the show. Yeah. I mean, that seems like a pretty weak response. And I didn't see he responded. He goes, Alex, mate, I don't understand this post. I was asked to come on the show a couple weeks ago or so ago, and this was my reply to producer on the 18th. He says, Daria, sorry for the delay. I'm writing and researching a book at the moment, and it's full on, head down, 7 days, all day, coming up for air occasionally. Can you ask me in early February, and we'll see how I am fixed then? I should be on the other side of the deep stuff by that time. He says that still stands. So it's interesting. That's a good point. So clearly he's aware that it wasn't about not coming on, but he said he was busy and he'd do it later. So much controlled narrative flow, man. It says that still stands. Not only do I want to discuss the Musk impact on the alternative media, it is also that these things are debated. No, it's important that they're debated. My problem is not with people using X while they can. Of course not. It is the hero worship, which Alex is a part of Musk, and the way that this has stopped his cult serving views and activities being questioned on the scale that they would have been before. No response there. Great point. Now, and again, other ones, for instance, I responded here saying, hey, I'd love to have you on. That's why I think that, based on that response, maybe it won't be until February. I'm not sure. We're in February, so we'll see. But you have, there's that image showing you all the check boxes of the WEF. Here's the Health Ranger, same thing. David, you're making a really important point. Elon sometimes goes off course and aligning with the same. My God, these people just can't see beyond the obvious. And even in response to something calling you out, you kind of have to be like, well, yeah, he is kind of bad, but he's still trying. Wow. Just come on. I agree with David completely in this sense. Now, here's what Caitlin Johnstone said, bringing us into more of the Israel conversation. If the Gaza genocide had happened pre-internet, it would have been a fringe issue hardly anyone knew about. And really think about this, because it shows you even with the media barely starting to talk about it, it shows you that it's you that changed the situation, guys. Because of the internet, yes, but it's you, the ability to be able to step past that. She says the Western press would have been able to get away with exponentially more cover-ups of the Israeli crimes. Western politicians would have been able to get away with more lies about what's really happening. Israeli officials would have been able to be far less careful about their statements of genocidal intent. And I don't think they're being careful at all, quite frankly. And the IDF would have been vastly more blatant and obvious about its extermination campaign. It's only because normal people like you are getting eyes into what's really happening that this issue is subject to a worldwide outcry and condemnation that has placed the empire on its back foot. The political media class never does the right thing because it wants to. Yeah, exactly my point I've been stressing. It does the right thing when it is forced to by normal human beings with healthy consciences like you. The fate of humanity rests on the ability of ordinary people to freely circulate truth. Well said. And think about that, though. The idea, it's only because normal people get eyes on this in the worldwide outcry, which shows you, first of all, that you literally can change things. And that's why they're so desperate for us to recognize the majority and do something about it. And I don't mean violence. I mean just simply things like this. And, you know, and more than just simply talking, obviously, but think about that. And the idea that it says they never do the right thing unless they're forced to by you. So always think about that, right? It's as I've said, sometimes it just aligns with what's most advantageous for what they're doing. This person says, and importantly, imagine what they did when we couldn't see their crimes on our phones. That's pretty chilling. Now, this is a really important point. Now, let me see real quickly. Where are we? Oops. Hold on. Where'd I end up? Right here. We're at 2 hours and 35 minutes. I always say this, but then it's probably going to go way longer. But I wanted to make sure I talked about this, but I don't want to miss some of these other points. Let's just keep going. We'll see how far we get. Alan Mizrahi makes an interesting point here. Now, there's slight things that I may disagree with. I'll point it out. But overall, I think this is an outstanding point. And it's really contentious because it gets in to the very point we're making about how, or I made earlier, about the idea of using, it was specifically Mayorkas, and that's where this comes into play again, the victimhood concept. In his case, where it doesn't even apply, and a lot of people are starting to see how that's being applied. And we need to understand in the context of how Zionism is using Judaism. Here's what he writes, and he's speaking as a Jew. He says, so why is Israel doing this? Is there anything in it for Israel but virtually global hate? Again, this is my point about how everybody sees this right now because it doesn't seem like there is. He says, a couple of days ago, I was going to provide an explanation, as he sees it, why Israel has chosen to conduct itself like this. And he says, here it is. Very provocative, and it's going to mess with your mind a bit. And he goes, I'll also remind you that he's Jewish, and he has the perfect right to his own opinions on Jewish affairs. Of course he does. But so, by the way, does anybody else, whether Jewish or not. Right? It's not anti-Semitic to have an opinion about things that apply to Jews or in any other context about Muslims or Christians. You know, it's just this, we need to recognize how this has been used. Now it says, before I go on, and as I know many people are going to read this, make sure that you follow me. And this, hold on, I forgot I was going to skip past throughout these months, I am sure you have asked yourselves why Israel is acting as if its design is to maximize the amount of hate it stands to receive from the global community. There have been so many occasions for this, but he said, but the last week when IDF soldiers executed 3 men in the hospital, it stood out. That's because the IDF took special care to get it televised. Now that's what he's arguing. But that's an interesting perspective to think about. They didn't confiscate cameras or servers. They didn't hack or destroy files. It's almost as if they were waiting for the cameras, like they wanted you to see this. The worldwide audiences got the message, and everyone was talking about the TV series meant to portray the humane face of Israel's apartheid. He says, how peculiar, right? And wait, what about all those videos by soldiers of themselves joyfully blowing up buildings and everything else? And what about the naked men filmed that they're humiliating in the humiliated hundreds? He says, let me remind you, for contrast, that in 2 years of Russia's war in Ukraine, not once have you seen Russian soldiers celebrating the destruction of civilian infrastructure. You've never seen naked and humiliated Ukrainians, soldiers loaded on trucks. You have, by the way, in the reverse, a lot of it. Think about that. And again, that Israel's funding this very group, Azov movement. But it says there may have been things like that happening. We don't know. But if scenes like these actually occurred, the Russian military took special care to hide them from you. Why not the IDF? Keep this question in mind. He says, what is the justification, the reason, or cause for the existence of organizations like AIPAC, ADL? Are American Jews in so much danger, he asks, and face so much persecution in the U.S. that perpetual billion-dollar operations are required to guard them from harm? Are Jews disproportionately jailed in the United States? No. Designated victims of violent crime? Well, in some cases, but not predominantly over other groups necessarily involved. Harassed by the authorities? No. Cannot be out in the street? Hardly. Is American society that laser focused on hating Jews? Well, they want you to think that, but I don't think that's the case. He says, aren't there other American communities who are more exposed to danger, harassment, poverty, and crime? Seriously, he's right. And say an organization like AIPAC does have some nostalgic reason for being. What is it doing pushing for wars? More specifically and currently, why are Jewish organizations in the United States alongside Israel doing all they possibly can to place Jews at the epicenter of a possible world war? Why are organizations that are supposed to keep Jews safe from making Jewish affairs the formal declared reason for a clash and a war that could destroy civilization as we know it? Isn't it the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing? Right, exactly. Say like a military that constantly broadcasts its own astonishing cruelty and destroys its own image. We are getting closer, he says. One more hurdle. I'm meant to skip those things. He's kind of interceding. But it says two very obvious opposites in seeing the world: paranoia and basic trust. This is true for people, but it's just as valid for political societies. Some societies are more paranoid and some are more relaxed, but no society on earth is more paranoid than the super mega ultra Jewish part of the Jewish people or wider society. Now remember, he's a Jew saying this. There is no other group on earth the world is so contently on its feet defending. I think he meant constantly. No other society, too, decided to use trauma as the center of its identity. Now, right there, I would read community, right? Because society would imply the Israeli state, which is not, in my opinion, is a Zionist entity. Well, it's not my opinion. It's a fact. He says, I know many of you, especially Americans, have come to see this as just Jewish. And that is the manipulation right there, right? Instead of recognizing the Zionist use of this victimhood concept, it ends up being Jews are like that, even though that's not the reality, even though there are Jews like that, because in my opinion, being pushed by a Zionist agenda. The point though, is that it ends up driving people to feel negative feelings against those people. And then it becomes misplaced hate, anger, racism, instead of recognizing what's really driving it. But he says, but it is not so, and maybe you need a Mizra Jew to tell you this, it is one strand of Jewish perception that derives its sense of identity from pogroms and the Holocaust. The kind like, somebody like a Ben Shapiro, right? Zionist. Israel and AIPAC act like this is natural and the only way to be Jewish. That's nonsense. Don't forget, Ben Shapiro called the Jewish Voices for Peace trash and insinuated they weren't Jewish because they had a different opinion. Pogroms and the Holocaust, he goes on, were not all the experience of all the Jews. Many Jewish communities knew long periods of safety and prosperity, including the ones, by the way, that lived in Palestine before it was occupied. Not all Jews were victims all the time, and Jews are definitely not the only victims humanity's ever known. Personally, he says, I always found it more than a little offsetting to hear American Jews refer to their misery and victimhood constantly in a country where millions of natives, organized in hundreds of thousands of flourishing communities, were wiped off the face of the planet. Native Americans. A country and culture that operated industrial-scale slavery on Black people for hundreds and hundreds of years and fought not to recognize them as equal humans for centuries more. And that's not unique to the United States, not even remotely. But the point is still the same. He goes on to say, I would never do that. He's speaking personally. A country that has so much terrible, dehumanizing poverty and homelessness, so much pain. How come the most successful, heavily represented in all things power and money minority in the society is also the greatest victim? He says, I know this is the norm and this is the description of reality I should conform to. He says, but no, it doesn't make sense. You can choose trauma and paranoia or trust and basic optimism as your guide in life. But the biggest Jewish organization in our lifetime chose one clear path, that of trauma, suspicion, and what can be called Armageddonism. Always alert, always someone out there to get you. Everybody hates us. And as we're almost at the end of his thread here, I will say the final part in little more directly. In choosing trauma and paranoia, both Israel and AIPAC found an unexpected source of false power. Because existential fear can bring a society of people together, but it's not going to be a society many people want to live in. So you keep people afraid all the time. And you make sure they are feeling or actually being hated all the time. This is how you maintain your power over them. And he's speaking as the Zionist entities over the Jewish community. As Jewish trauma, and as Jewish trauma has become such a huge international political thing, he says, again, I wouldn't do that. The incentive was always there to keep this mentality alive, to organize around it, to make sure it remains the formal doctrine of Jewish institutions, such as AIPAC in Israel. So Israel and American Jewish organizations took it upon themselves to keep Jews afraid and isolated. This strategy of international paranoia has been working for a while, but it gradually eroded. It especially eroded in the United States as younger Jews became increasingly aware that the stories they've been told are lies and that no one really cares about their ethnicity. That erosion in the power of instilled exceptionalism, isolationism, and existential fear poses a very serious problem for Jewish organizations built around paranoia. The Palestinians and Arabs were a wonderful solution for this problem for a while by keeping Palestinians oppressed and thus hostile. An old myth of anti-Semitism as a huge international force could be kept on life support. Right? All those Muslims over there hate us because we're Jews. Constant. And in fact, the point is creating that narrative, not be, I mean, like in the sense of like he's talking about, but also actually seeding, videos, school materials that they then later point back and say, that's what they were teaching them. Or was it? And maybe it did ultimately end up becoming something that because of what they pushed. But you have to realize where this comes from. My point is that the very stuff they point at going, this is what they were teaching them. Do you not remember that they were funding Hamas to be this divisive entity? Where do you think that stuff came from? Now it goes on to say the Palestinians and Arabs, last part. He says the anti-Semitism, a huge international force on life support. He says, but this too began to fade, using Palestinians to keep that threat going, as younger American Jews started getting more familiar with the Palestinian perspectives. And then October 7th hit. And the right-wing, nationalistic, paranoid section of the Jewish political spectrum, in particular the religious Zionism party, realized it could be translated into political gold. And right there, we should truly still ask whether that might have been something that was manufactured. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that might have been part of what happened. And that even makes more sense when you might think it was just a part of their government. And that's why it was so disjointed. But it says this could be used to revive the old sentiments. The ghetto, the pogroms, the trains, the East, all of it. This is why Nazis were invoked so early on, which again, didn't even make sense. Jews were once again the persecuted minority. AIPAC and Netanyahu always told you they were. How wonderful for them. Oh, look, we found a book. We found Mein Kampf. Oh, look, we found the Nazi book over there. But October 7th was not enough because people would immediately put it in the context of the illegal occupation, which they did. They would ask the eternal human question, why did it happen? What happened before this? If you're Netanyahu or AIPAC, putting Jews in the context of normal human behavior is the last thing you want to do. What you want is boiling rage and fear to be extensively covered in all the media and all the briefings. Why? Because emotion will always circumvent logic. I should say always, but it does. Need I say more? Basically, he continues. And this is where my final point arrives, is it doesn't seem like Israel is trying to be hated globally, in his opinion anyway. It is actually what it's doing. He makes a very valid point. It is internationally airing its cruelty and barbarity so that it will remain closed up to the world, thus guaranteeing the continued rule of the paranoid camp. They are doing it on purpose, he argues. I still am not sure if I agree with that, but this is a very logical point. For cynical political gains, he argues, out of a twisted reading of history and of human nature. Palestinians are just crash test dummies in this scenario. They count for nothing from the Zionist perspective. Their deaths are used to get people angry and Israel hated. So it becomes even more paranoid. And in that point, he's speaking of the Jewish population. For the same reason, AIPAC is putting the Jewish issue at the epicenter of the lead up to World War III. They cannot not know that Jews will be called as responsible, or at least a major factor in it. That is, if you are not seeing the full picture. So if you're watching TLAV, you already know it. You know this is Zionist manipulation, or at least that's a factor you'll consider. I believe that. But he goes on, can you imagine millions of dead Americans, destroyed cities, populations stressed into panic and despair, all because of a war Jewish organizations pushed for? I would argue Zionist organizations. How does anyone who purports to represent Jews and care for them not recoil from this scenario? Do these people have any idea at all what they're doing? He says, and I'm sorry for sounding this impolite and not nice, He says, we are on the eve of potential world war. He says, as a Jew, I'm terrified. He said, the last thing I want is to be blamed for world war. But the Jewish paranoia camp, which again, he's arguing is a small portion of the full Jewish community, seems to relish the opportunity. Maybe they are sure this is how the Messiah comes. I have my reservations. That's interesting, right? Because you have to remember, there are clear prophecies stemming directly from the Zionist manipulation of it all, right? The extremist side of it, that they believe there's some kind of prophecy to all of this. What's interesting, though, in regard to the minority, the majority of it all, is that they really push the idea that Israel is the representation of every Jew in the world. But we're beginning to see that there's a lot of organizations that are like, they don't represent me. We should ask whether that's the majority. Finally, he says, Jewish organizations centered around trauma found a very welcoming and happy to help friend in American imperialists, rather the government. It is so wonderful when you can market Middle East invasions as battling anti-Semitism. Who could argue with you? In the name of defending Israel, the U.S. can do whatever it wants. It has the perfect moral cover. At least it did before this all fell apart in their hands. It will support an actual genocide. It will go completely insane. That's what we're watching. He says, what they, both AIPAC and the U.S. establishments, are not including in their calculations is that a big war in the Middle East can have very devastating results for both the U.S. and Israel. In their quest for creating a Jewish psyche, that a world beneficial to their paranoid vision, which Americans shares as a colonial power. Don't forget, it is also a colonial power that don't take into account that reality is a whole different business from propaganda, right? They can screen their narrative as long as they want, but they've lost control of the reality. He says, but this is why they do it and televise and broadcast it so that we are hated. He's speaking as Jews, isolated, fearful, and controlled by Bibi and AIPAC forever. There's nothing that reassures those people as hate for Israel. Don't fight people who thrive on hate with hate. And listen to this. Fight them with clarity and resolve. That is important. Because right now, what this will drive from people stuck in the two-party paradigm is hatred for them in reverse. And that's what we need to avoid, driving more of the same thing. Now, again, I'm not sure if I agree with every exact, I think there's more to it. We can't ignore all the foreknowledge, which that might be attributed to the fact that like one aspect of their government wanted this to happen and so on. But there's a lot more to this. The Hannibal Directive, right? Even just the idea that I don't think this makes sense in that concept, because this could very well be the end of Israel based on what they've created. And same with the United States. I don't see how you can logically argue this. They would still perceive this to be in their benefit at this moment. So there's more to this, but you can't deny the logic of what he's saying. And this is called racist, even discussing this point. Even though we all seem to acknowledge we can see this happening, there's entire Jewish communities that are avidly calling this out. Here, again, is Gideon Levy explaining the same thing. We just talked about this the other day. Nope, that's not it. Son of a gun. Oh, it's right there. Oh, wait, no, that's not it. 1 second. I guess I didn't include it. There it is.
Israeli. I was born in Israel. I even perceive myself as an Israeli patriot. I care about Israel. I belong to Israel. I'm attached to Israel. Don't speak about symmetry because there is no symmetry. I would even suggest that there is no conflict. Was there a French-Algerian conflict? There was a brutal French occupation in Algeria, which came to its end. And there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a brutal Israeli occupation which must come to its end one way or the other. In our backyard, there is a regime which is today by far one of the most cruel, brutal tyrannies on earth. And I know what I say because I cover it for 40 years. And this regime cannot be defined but as an apartheid. Two peoples live on one piece of land. One people has all the rights in the world, and I'm talking now only about the occupied territories. One people has all the rights in the world. The other people has no rights whatsoever. It looks like apartheid. It talks like apartheid. It is apartheid. And nobody can contradict it. Go to the Jordan Valley. See the prosperity in the settlements, and then go and see the Palestinians who live there without electricity, without water, without any rights. And then tell me if it's apartheid or you might invent it another title.
right? Very, very sound, very, but so, there's going to be people that disagree, right? And that's, I welcome that. But just consider the points, like in regard to the point I was making before, just consider the points about if you're of the mind that this is not about Zionism, but rather the other way around. The problem here is that you have to recognize that there's a lot of people in the Jewish community that are not part of that. They get treated just like Palestinians, like Ethiopian Jews, right? Or any Jew that decides to speak out against Zionism is beat up in the streets by the IDF. Like that. So how do you factor that in with that point? Or the fact that even if you do think that's the real point, you then have to realize that just because somebody then is Jewish doesn't make them like that. The point would logically then read that if they are Jewish, they're part of that problem. But so you're telling me a child born today is suddenly part of the problem? I mean, that's the same kind of logic that becomes, it's a broad stroke, right? And just the same point I could make, that you can say there's a Zionist out there who is a good person that doesn't realize they're part of this. I just don't know how that's likely based on the fact that it's easy to see what they're promoting. And if you're willing to promote a genocide, I don't see how you're a good person. My point would be, though, it's still possible that somebody could be within that and not recognize that. The point is, it's obvious to prove that Zionism has used Judaism as some kind of barrier between what they are doing. Now, if you then think that that's somehow the reverse, I just again argue that it seems to me that there's holes in that. In the reverse, there's really not. But think for yourselves. I could very well be wrong, but I think it's important, especially from the game of using racism, using anti-Semitism against the free speech. Like, I think that's where that ends up going, where people then argue that Jews inherently are the problem, and then you are exactly what they utilize to shut people down, to censor. And again, it's a broad stroke. So anyway, I think that's pretty damn clear. I think that's obvious that there's a problem. Anyway, I think that's clear. And on top of that, I think that the documentation is very clear, right? That it's obvious that this is something that they built, that they knew they were lying about, that they covered up, right? And I think that's the important part about it. Now, here's a couple points I want to finish off with, just to show you this kind of concept. Like, so what we're just talking about is the idea of using their victimhood to basically as an entity, as the Zionist entity, to kind of bolster themselves against, or more specifically, to manipulate the Jews into being some kind of bolster between them and the world. And this is what he is talking about exactly. But it's the victimhood part of it. Here is somebody I'm not familiar with, but I've seen her rapidly promoting the Israeli agenda, saying, "Congrats to this bigot for holding the most anti-Semitic sign I've ever seen this week. How many tropes can you spot?" Right. So this is my point. All these anti-Semitic tropes, or is it just what's happening? And you then contort those into meaning, oh, that's that old blood libel. Well, Eli David does the same thing in reverse on Twitter. But that's not what you're looking at here. What you're looking at is a scale of justice, I guess, with the U.S. in the middle, which shows you they don't care. On one side, you've got stop the genocide, free Palestine, with a bunch of dead people. Okay, show me where there's a trope in there. That's happening. They're literally murdering people, 30,000 plus, and free Palestine means nothing but free Palestine. You can't keep contorting these things into some abstract point you want it to mean. Then on the other side, it shows an oil drill, right? That represents the LNG, hundreds of billions that they're trying to get within Gaza, and the money attached to it, right? Then it shows Star of David with money in it, same point. And then international law crossed out, democracy crossed out, justice crossed out. So, of course, when you pretend that there's a secret knock that Jews and money, that's what you are making it into. They're talking about the Zionist government, or let's just say Israel as a government, capitalizing on the destruction of Palestine while reaping the benefits from the oil in the ground. But you then turn that into, which I don't even know where you're seeing other tropes in there. Can you spot all the tropes? Only in your paranoid mind, because the reality is that is exactly what's really going on. They turn it into people trying to cover the reality, is all I meant right there. They turn it into whatever they want to hide behind the allegation that you must be racist if you're pointing out what Israel's doing. It's ridiculous. And then here's that point again. I don't need to play it again, right? But you got Mayorkas with this even look he's got. Like, it's just like the one-shot silver bullet, where he literally asked me after being, "You're a terrible job as the Secretary of Homeland Security." He goes, "Maybe you didn't know that I am the child of a Holocaust survivor." It's like, what does that have to do with anything? That's the point. It's the identity. Now here, very quickly, we're going to rapidly skim through these because I want to get out, hopefully, oh no, too late. It's already 1 minute before. But I want to make it clear again, and I've made this point excessively, but it's so important to understand because yet again, you're seeing this circulate in the media where they're saying Hamas denies a hostage exchange. Now, there's a fraction of truth to that, as the Jerusalem Post writes. Hamas denies rejection of hostage ceasefire deal, says it will deliver answers soon. The point, though, and actually they just changed this title, by the way, which kind of screws up my point, but it's so frustrating how often that happens. Check this out. Look back at the different versions. If somebody saved it, hopefully. Guess not. Oh, well. Like the Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Haaretz, and the Daily Mail is a classic example. They refresh constantly, and the things change. And here we go. Let's do a couple of them, see if they're different. Ooh, who cares? We will not agree to any hostage deal at any price. See my point? Very different, isn't it? Which now it's saying, and it's the same link, by the way. There's not even an update. They didn't claim to change anything. Hamas denies rejection hostage. That's how they just changed it to. Updated February 4th. So ridiculous. So the point is, Netanyahu publicly said, we will not agree to any hostage deal at any price. Yeah. I wonder why they changed that. The point is that he's making it very clear. We will not do that for anything. And yet then weirdly turning that into Hamas said no to the thing that we just said we wouldn't do at any price. You see how wildly dishonest this is? Like and how do you think we're not going to see that? This is about manipulating at just the bare minimum. The people who were already on the fence, people that don't really care to look further. It's very clear what's happening. Looks like see, all three of them are the same, except the last one they just changed. Because they're trying to hide that, I think. Hamas denies rejection of hostages. The point is, clearly, as he says right here, we appreciate the support of the American administration. That's not the main one. We will not stop the war until we eliminate Hamas. Return all the kidnapped people, which, by the way, anyway, to cut to the chase, and I'm trying to rush. You know the point. As this person says, fact check, Biden is not stopping a ceasefire. Israel's not stopping a ceasefire. It's Hamas. Of course it's Hamas. Is it? No agreement of any hostage exchange at any price. And yet that's Hamas's fault. How do you make that make sense? Now, what is actually part of what's happening, my point is this is what just finally happened, where he's going, look, no hostage deal at any price. But what was happening before that is they were essentially Hamas, and which, by the way, as I understand it, is still on the table, a full exchange. Every hostage for every hostage and complete ceasefire and humanitarian aid. Now, which is obviously not what Israel wants, but they're offering every hostage they have. And Israel pretends like that's all they're doing this for. And nobody believes them, not even their own people. And yet you've got these kind of sycophants online going, they're the ones not allowing the thing. And the point is they might return with an offer saying a 3-day ceasefire for 25 people. And Hamas is like, stop offering these ridiculous deals. Because the point is what they've done already was release people and then arrest just as many and the same ones right back up again and go right back to bombing. It's a joke. It's an insult to your intelligence. It's going to continue the same thing. So they're saying, we want a full ceasefire. If you are honest about wanting your hostages, here's all of them. And they say no every time. Now, this is China speaking up, basically saying that there's only one group who continues to veto what everybody else wants. It's the U.S. government. So the U.S. is also complicit. Uh-oh. That's weird. Those started playing on me. The U.S. government is also complicit in making sure this continues because they veto what everybody else would have. It's not like Israel would have listened anyway. But the point is that they would have had at least on the record that everybody in the world wanted a ceasefire except Israel and the United States, or probably the UK too. But the U.S. vetoes it, and so nobody pays attention. And the point is that this is today. Thousands of Israelis rally in Tel Aviv to demand a deal. And of course, what's hilarious is people like Elon Levy on Twitter will show you this and go, they're calling for you to surrender, Hamas. No, they're not. These are the people that are busting into your Knesset rallies or Knesset meetings and screaming, I think I even have one of those, maybe not. I guess not. I showed one yesterday at the last show. The point is that these are the people, the families that are busting into the Knesset going, you're murdering our families. How dare you act like you care? And they just lie. They know what they're doing. They're continuing the war while refusing the exchange for their own people, while pretending like bombing and flooding those tunnels is not risking their lives. They don't want them back, guys. That's the Hannibal Directive, because that's actually what's happening. Now, this is one of those points. This is just one of these videos. You guys can watch it. I was going to play it, but we'll jump past it, where he's saying Hamas captive, who, by the way, is one of the people that came out saying they were treated kindly, saying, bring them home now. Well, you just refused 2 different offers for them, so it's your fault they're not coming home. But my point is, when saying the lives of hostages are in danger every moment, there's no food, no water, no daylight, in the end, there will be no one left to save them. Sure, if you pretend like she's saying that because Hamas bad guy, it might make sense. But then you watch it and you realize she's literally describing what Israel's doing, because all of them are right now. Withholding aid, indiscriminately bombing. When she says no one left to save, that's exactly what the families are saying. You're putting your agenda above their lives. Hamas continues to offer a full exchange that Israel continues to refuse. That's not that they support Hamas. They want you to kill Hamas. They just recognize the obvious lapse of reality here. They want their families back. You say you want them back. They offer them. You refuse. And then bomb where they might be. There's no misunderstanding that. So he is using what they're saying about what they're doing, killing IDF, killing their own people, to act like that's them supporting Israel's agenda. Like, think about how sinister that is. You don't care about anybody when you do stuff like that. And then, talking about UNRWA for a quick second, Blinken says the evidence of UNRWA staffers, highly, highly credible. The evidence that he admits he hasn't even seen. This person's a clown. Quote, we haven't had the ability to investigate the allegations ourselves, but they're highly, highly credible. Oh, because Israel says that Netanyahu just speaking through your mouth now? How sad is that? And then he went on to stress how indispensable, his word, UNRWA is to the people of Gaza, but then defunds them entirely, just in case, right? Because we care. These people have lost all credibility. I mean, my God. Now, Soleimani Ahmed, which I'll probably talk about again, shows you a Telegram breakdown, which, by the way, has been widely reported. I think even Haaretz has covered this. Netanyahu's son is angry. He expresses his anger that the Hannibal Directive was not deployed in its entirety. He says, quote, there is a procedure called the Hannibal Directive. The planes that were supposed to be in the air on the Gaza border were supposed to destroy everything that moves there, crush everything, and thus we would not have 256 prisoners. That's what he said. He's complaining. He says the fact that they did not bomb that means that there is a big problem with the Air Force, because they didn't want these liabilities. They didn't want to have them come back and admit their lies about Hamas are lies, or that they were treated kindly, or they knew they were bombed by their own government. He's expressing frustration that they didn't kill more of their own people. Just digest that. Here's the Quds News Network. His name is Yair Netanyahu, the son of Netanyahu. Explains on the Telegram channel that the military did not execute the Hannibal Directive fully enough. Wow. And then this Karen Zellwer says, I have a genuine question for all the critics of Israel, military experts. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists broke into Israel and murdered, raped, and maimed, right? So 2 of those being fake news that's been debunked by pretty much everybody, and took hostage Israeli citizens and vowed to do it again. Or, the controlled Israeli leadership that's in Qatar did, and they pretended that's what everybody else was saying, typical. What exactly would you have been what exactly would have been the best response, or the correct response? Well, let me tell you. I said, first, find out why your security failed. Then go to the United Nations, which would have been falling all over themselves to support Israel as usual, despite Israeli narratives, and then begin the legal process of actually removing Hamas with an on-the-ground surgical raids with international support. NATO would have had your back, right? But that was not what Israel wanted to do with its Hamas proxy army, which I linked to. Instead, the Zionist government went full genocide immediately and have killed Palestinians and Israelis alike ever since. So to directly answer your question, what would have been the correct response? To maybe not immediately and spectacularly violate international law, and maybe not initiate the illegal and despicable Hannibal Directive, killing your own people, as a start. So really, do anything that's not illegal. And they went full Zionist instead. I mean, really think about that question and realize, like, what else could we have possibly done? Like, literally anything else would have been probably a better, like, nothing illegal. Step one. My God. David Collier says Hamas could surrender. Hamas could release the hostages. Like, don't you love this argument? Like, sure, they could. That's one of the fringe possibilities. Why would that happen? Like it says here, 100,000 protest the war on the streets and not a single call for Hamas to surrender. Well, that's not true. You're doing it right now. All of Zionists, that's all they're saying. Hamas surrender. So that's dumb. So you're lying about that. But what's crazy about it, why exactly would anybody call on the terrorist group to surrender? That's your framing, right? Why you're upset that we're not marching the streets going, Hamas should surrender. Are we acting like that's going to influence them? Like they care what we think? This is just a propaganda construct to make it look like supporting anything but what he's saying is terrorism. This is just lunatic. This is stupidity. He says instead they call for victory to the resist. No, they don't. They call for a ceasefire, which you then contort into something other than what it is. What he says is it's like 100,000 people marching through London calling on the Nazis to win. I mean, no, nobody's calling for either side to win, you absolute infant. What they're saying is a ceasefire to actually help the people who you otherwise pretend you're trying to save, but then in other conversations make it very clear you hate all of them, Palestinians. But these false analogies, like it's just so embarrassing. What if Hamas did surrender? What would happen? You'd kill them immediately. Like, that's what you keep saying. So why would they do it? Like, it's just this game that's played. Scott Ritter responds by saying Israel could surrender. Israel could turn over all the Palestinians as illegally detained. After all, Israel is losing the conflict, but you keep coping as best you can. Now, Robert's actually working on an article that's about that exact point, that they've already lost. Now, Marina Medvin, and this is the point about the material, points this out, saying Palestinian civilians, even children, boys as young as 10, participated in the October 7th massacre. I don't see any evidence of that. Now, what we can see is random civilians running through the open fence, but there's no evidence that they were involved in some kind of coordinated attack. They're saying a 28-year-old potato farmer watched Palestinian children go from house to house in his kibbutz, or at least that's what we're being told, seeing as how so much of what we relayed were lies, and they continue to say them anyway. The boys laughed as the Palestinian adults killed or kidnapped. I find that really hard to believe. But they were going in front of terrorists, laughing with their friends and looking very calm. Okay. First, and then the other point was this following up going, they might wonder why. And they show a video that's like this Mickey Mouse knockoff that's talking about killing Jews. Now, my point is, certainly could be from people that are Palestinian. It's possible based on all the stuff that's happened after 75 years of brutal occupation, apartheid, rape, murder, and theft. But 2 points. One is, these are the same people trying to convince you that they're not going after Palestinians, but it's only Hamas. But then in literally every other breath, they're giving you justification for why probably everybody else is bad too. Doesn't that seem a little bit suspicious? Pretty obvious. But other point is that this material they point to, and these, first of all, the claim of that, there's no evidence to that effect. This is a statement floated by people who claim they saw this, who have an interest in defending all these narratives, right? Illegal settlers, too. That's what they're talking about. People from these kibbutz. But most of these are IDF narratives. But the other part is these kind of material that you're talking about here, these come from the kind of things we're talking about. And even they'll tell you that. That's a Hamas video. Well, who funded Hamas to be the very thing to destabilize the country enough to not allow a two-state solution, to be what Israel wanted it to become? So where do you think this stuff comes from? It's so infuriating to make this argument. But either way, I think it's obvious that there's a manipulation taking place. I'm going to skip this one. It's just more crazy stuff saying, what can we possibly say to the children of Gaza? Basically saying, give up on your culture, your friends, your family, and then we'll claim that you're not a terrorist. The children, mind you. Just showing you yet again, even from the New York Times, arguing that they're all bad. Now, lastly, Daniela Modas, who I was trying to reference the other day, you're doing good work covering a lot of what's going on there. She shared these images with me from a Telegram group that was documenting the North after they pulled back. Children's skeletons, people's hands that were bound behind their backs when they were killed. Now, this was also just covered by Mohammed Safa, who is the representative of the United Nations, accredited at the Geneva office, talking about the same thing. 30 bodies of Palestinians found handcuffed, blindfolded, and thrown in garbage at a school in Gaza. Genocide. Here, though, is Al Jazeera. Palestinians demand international inquiry after a mass grave found in Gaza. This was the first of the month. And it is exactly what we're talking about. It's blindfolded, shot, executed, and this is becoming hard to ignore at this point. Here's a quick video showing you on record one of these things happening. Now, of course, people are saying, and it doesn't look like he was killed, right? It looks like a shot in the leg.
So what did him?
But, you know, you could argue that the people are like, oh, it was edited. Well, sure. Be skeptical, man. Be skeptical of all of it all the time. The point is, this is something that happens constantly. The Amnesty International outlets posted about this, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations. So let's not pretend like these things aren't happening. Everybody recognizes what's going on, and there's a lot about this. Here is a very hard to watch video that I'm actually not going to play for you. It's very graphic and a lot of dead bodies. This is the chairman of the Euromed Human Rights Group saying the first documented footage of a field execution documented by their group, prompted by the UN Human Rights Group to urge an investigation. Despite all documented evidence, Israel denied having forces in the area, and they continue to make more and more death take place as they are told they're supposed to be walking back their genocide. Here's even CNN. They have a video showing Palestinians detainees blindfolded, barefoot, and near Israel-Gaza border. Here's what it says. More than 24 men are sitting and kneeling on the wet, cold ground near the Gaza border, blindfolded, barefoot. Israeli soldiers, their faces obscured, baklava, standing guard. Basically, people so physically exhausted, they can see from looking at them, trying to lay down, forcing them to get back up on their knees. That's what they're talking about. That's a form of torture in and of itself. But what they're saying is, the Israeli military said, guess what? They're suspected of terror activity and were arrested in Gaza and transferred to Israel for further interrogation. Not investigation, interrogation, torture. But the point is, they're suspected. So you're telling me they're suspected, and yet you declothe them, blindfold them, hold them in exhausting positions for as long as you can, and beat them up, which we keep showing you. Yes. And this is what we're trying to show you. And then what does that become? They're all terrorists. Here's one of the people we just pointed to. Here's she saying, the UN represented at the latest terrorist bust. Oh, was it a terrorist bust? It's the same. We're talking about the same thing. Or were they suspected because they were present and Palestinian? Think about how dumb this is, by the way. They'll take anything and lie about anything. The Zionists will. Here's what he says, which is right. Oh, they just happened to wear their UN vest while they were fighting soldiers? Come on, guys. We can't be that stupid. The point is they arrested anybody, and just like the Mossad did with their own account and said, look at all the terrorists that came out of the tunnel. And then 3 seconds later, they released 99% of them. And they didn't come out of a tunnel. They arrested them inside of that UN location, which all came out in the days later. But the Mossad group, which, big surprise, they're an intelligence asset. They lie. Here is what the Al Jazeera, one of the breakdowns, this is 8 hours ago. Officials said 4,800 students killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Sadiq Al-Qadour, a spokesman for the Gaza Ministry of Education, has said that since October 7th, more than 8,400 others have been injured, in addition to 240 faculty and teachers killed. That's on top of 4,800 students. He said the numbers do not reflect the psychological and emotional well-being of students and teachers and the health situation of those who are displaced and living in unsanitary, crowded shelters. He also said told Al Jazeera that 285 schools have been damaged by Israeli shelling and bombardment. In the West Bank alone, 43 students have been killed in the past 120 days, in addition to, quote, dozens who have been detained by Israeli forces. It's just so blatant how obvious this is, blatant how bad this is. Now, in general, we're at a long time here. I'll talk about this coming up soon, but this is important. Shibumi Zen Temple made this point, and you can break down the thread, and he is correct after my investigation on this, that this is an image that's been circulated. And you can see on the flag that it says Palestina. And so people have been using this to argue, here's the proof that Palestinians are Nazis. Guess what? It's completely false. Here's a breakdown investigation of this. And here's even the guy's thread, who is pretty strong following, about 100,000 people, breaking down this investigation. It's in Spanish. The point, just cut to the chase. And you can even using the reverse image search, you can find this stuff. This is the World Zionist Organization receiving permission from Hitler to organize around 40 military professional training centers on German territory, in addition to future settlers from Palestine. Because at this point, it was still Palestine. That's the truth. And so they were holding the flag as the World Zionist Organization, because this is an agreement that was being made. It says, here we can see the Zionist organization, Betar, parading in Germany in 1934. That's the reality. And but they lie about it because that's the way you do it as a Zionist, right? But you can research this. It's very clear. But the point is, there's a lot more. Oh, I didn't include it. That's right. I forgot that. The point is, we've shown you that many times. As Dan Cohen has broken down, that the Lehi Party, one of the foundational elements of Zionism, twice tried to align itself with Nazi Germany. Here's just one more example of exactly that. And there's more evidence in this if you want to read through the whole thing, showing you that's very clear. It's very, very clear. So they know they were trying to align themselves with Nazis, and instead of, hiding that, admitting it, they just pretend it was Palestinians because people will toe the line. And Quds News Network also breaks down, Haaretz has been reporting that the Israeli military has admitted that this 72 Virgins No Censorship Telegram channel, that they said you were racist for insinuating it was an IDF group. They've been publishing lies and scenes of gruesome Palestinians being killed and cheering and laughing about it. They just admitted that was their channel. Here's the Hebrew version. The IDF admits the Telegram channel that published propaganda for the Israeli audience was activated by the Operations Division. This is Haaretz. Here's the English version. Graphic videos and incitement, how the IDF is misleading Israelis on Telegram. But nobody cares about that, right? We're not going to fold that into the U.S. conversation, are we? They're lying. They're knowingly lying. Not only are they knowingly lying, they're using this to pretend that Palestinians are X, Y, and Z, that they've committed X, Y, and Z crimes to justify what they're doing. This just could not be more clear. And then finally, just in case you missed it, Massey just posted that Speaker announced that next week the House will vote on a bill that will send $14 billion more to Israel. Hopefully it gets voted down. It hasn't passed yet, but that's what's happening. While committing a genocide, while bombing foreign countries that are impoverished because of you for their agenda, by doing literally everything that seems, on top of that, trying to pass a bill to give $14 billion on top of the billions and billions already being given. God, if they just decided to stop, this would end today. But they choose to be complicit in genocide. Well, thank you for tuning in today, guys. A lot of important stuff to talk about, as you can clearly tell. We'll continue to stay up on these topics to keep you informed as best we can. If you'd like to support this platform, there's a lot of links below to do so. We need your support because we're under attack, as always, but really just keep spreading the word, get the information out there, open this up to people, talk about it, spread the word. Thank you for being here. I love you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.